Snow drifted across the courtyard of Winterfell in lazy spirals, the wind carrying with it the quiet laments of an early winter. The day felt hushed and pregnant with portents. Within the great hall, lords and soldiers gathered around a dais where a single chair awaited, carved from the ancient weirwood of the Wolfswood, set before the sigil of the dire wolf that had guarded these lands for centuries. Servants moved like ghosts through the hush, ensuring everyone who had traveled from near and far was warmed with mulled wine. A hush so thick lingered in the air that every shift of a boot, every distant clang of steel from the ramparts, echoed through the hall like an omen. Eddard Stark stood near the dais, lips pressed thin, his face thoughtful. He was a man always careful in speech, but today he looked more burdened than ever, as if an unseen weight had settled on his shoulders. Near him stood Robert Baratheon, broad-shouldered and tall, his dark hair falling loose around a face still marked by the fierce joys and tragedies of recent rebellion. He was too restless for the solemn calm of the moment, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his jaw set. The great warhammer he had once borne in battle was nowhere in sight. Today, he wore only a sword, ceremonial though it might be. Across the hall, a cluster of northern lords, Karstark, Bolton, Umber, watched this new beginning with their own brand of curiosity and wariness. Each bore stories of how Robert had earned this moment through blood spilled, alliances forged, and the quiet vow the North had made to see a righteous king sit on a throne. Yet no one could deny that it all felt strange, for the seat of true power was supposed to be far to the south, in the city of King's Landing. But times had changed, and more than that, so had the men who survived the rebellion. A hush fell as the doors at the rear of the hall swung open. In strode Lady Catelyn Stark, her head held high, offering a kind of quiet dignity that the moment required. Behind her came Maester Luwin, carefully balancing a polished wooden crown upon a soft cushion. The crown glinted with gold inlaid with iron, an unusual mix that felt both severe and regal. Northern practicality fused with southern splendor. Whispers flitted in the corners of the room. Men who had fought a war to depose a tyrant now bore witness to the crowning of a king in a place that had never crowned one before. Many harbored misgivings, or at least unsettled hearts, for they knew what it meant to wear a crown. And they knew Robert Baratheon, or thought they did. Still, the steps leading to the dais seemed to speak of inevitability. The old ways and the new had converged in Winterfell. Ned Stark gave a single nod to Maester Luwin. The old man stepped forward with the cushion, approaching Robert carefully, as if worried some last vestige of Targaryen wrath would crash through the walls at this final pivotal moment. Robert knelt, his broad back tense beneath the furs draped around his shoulders. The hush in the great hall seemed to draw even more taut. Was this rightful, or was it folly? Ned turned to face the assembled watchers, lords and ladies and knights and bannermen, all with their own stories and secrets. But in this quiet instant, they were unified. The North, winter-bound and loyal, and the new king who had fought side by side with them in the rebellion. Ned took the crown from Luwin's cushion and raised it with both hands. Robert bowed his head. His breath hung in the frosty air, but no one dared speak. One might recall a time when Robert had once joked that the cold of the North would freeze him solid, that he longed for the sunshine of the Stormlands. But those days of jests seemed far away now. With a deliberate movement, Ned set the crown upon Robert's thick locks. A collective intake of breath arose. In that moment, Robert Baratheon was no longer just the rebel lord who had broken Rhaegar Targaryen on the banks of the Trident. He became the man the North had chosen to be king. The ceremony ended almost as soon as it began, but the weight of it lingered. Robert stood slowly, lifting his gaze to the rows of men assembled before him. The lines at the corners of his eyes hinted at relief, sadness, triumph, an almost immeasurable swirl of emotions that war had etched upon him. He cleared his throat. It was never his strength, speeches, but the hush demanded words. "I have been called many things," Robert began, his voice rumbling in the still air. "A storm lord, a warrior, perhaps even a fool. But today, I stand before you humble." He paused, as if uncertain how to continue, for Robert Baratheon was no poet. "You fought with me. You bled with me, and though I never thought to see a crown placed on my head in the north, I thank you. I will not forget the loyalty shown by House Stark, nor by the North as a whole." A ripple of assent passed through the crowd, though it was subdued. Tradition had been upended, and everyone present could feel the subtle quake of new powers forming, old ones dissolving. Ned lifted a hand in a quiet sign of welcome to those gathered. Then, with a gesture that was part courtesy, part command, he led Robert from the dais and through a side door into the more private antechamber beyond the hall. The newly crowned king's steps were measured, as though he were still straining to absorb the magnitude of this shift. "You wore that well," Ned said softly once they were alone, or at least as alone as they could be. A small hearth fire flickered in the corner, its flames dancing over the stones as if uncertain of their own place. Robert exhaled, running a hand through his hair, as if to assure himself that the crown truly sat there. "I never asked for this, Ned." He gave a rueful chuckle, though his eyes held no mirth. "We wanted justice, you and I. Justice for my betrothed and your sister. And now this." He hesitated, brow furrowed, as if trying to parse out the shape of destiny that had led them here. "You have to guide me, old friend. I may be a fair hand with a hammer, but a kingdom is a different beast altogether." "Damn ho." Ned's sober expression softened. "You have good men around you, Robert, men who fought for this cause. The North was never one for illusions. If we stand behind you, it's because we believe in your claim to the throne. But you must also earn the loyalty of the rest of the realm, or everything we've accomplished could turn to dust." Robert gave a short nod, stepping toward the fire. He rubbed his hands together, seeking its warmth. Outside the antechamber's narrow window, the snows continued their gentle descent. "We'll do it," he said at last. "We must, for Lyanna's sake, and for all our sakes. The Targaryens are broken, but their remnants could still haunt us." Ned said nothing. The memory of Lyanna weighed too heavily between them for mere words to ease that burden. Their conversation was interrupted by a soft knock. Maester Leuven eased the door open. "Your Grace," he addressed Robert, clearly practicing a new form of address. "The lords are gathering in the great hall for a feast. They await your presence, along with that of Lord Stark." Robert turned, drew a deep breath, and nodded. With the weight of a new crown, he allowed himself a moment to glance at Ned, who simply inclined his head. Then they stepped out together, wearing the mantle of king in hand in spirit, if not in formal title. The feast was subdued by southern standards, but the North knew how to celebrate in its own way. There was roasted boar, venison stew thick with barley, freshly baked bread, and casks of ale and wine. The hall echoed with raised voices. Men passed horns of ale from one table to another in silent toasts to the new king, to the memory of fallen comrades, and to the uncertain future. Above all, the unmistakable tang of winter air crept in through the cracks of the great doors, as though reminding everyone that the North could never be tamed. Robert, for his part, tried to laugh and cheer with the best of them. He toasted the great lords of the North by name, recalling stories of battle and brotherhood, bringing quick grins to their faces. But the mood was still far from the riotous revels that Robert was rumored to enjoy in his Storm's End days. This was the North, and the cause for the crowning was half a victory tinted with sorrow. The Targaryen madness had ended, but the cost in blood was still fresh in everyone's mind. Across the hall, seated at a corner of the high table, Catelyn Stark watched with studied grace. Her presence, though quiet, anchored Ned whenever he cast a glance her way. She was neither smiling nor frowning. Rather, she seemed to assess each face that turned her way, each posture and passing exchange. For all her southern upbringing, she seemed to have adopted the North's measured approach to celebration. She could sense something swirling in the corridors of power they had unleashed. She had heard whispered talk in the corridors, the concerns of lesser lords who asked, would Robert hold the other kingdoms in thrall now that he had the North behind him? Would he demand fealty as the Targaryens had done, or would he return to King's Landing eventually, attempting to mend the fractures in the realm? Occasionally, Catelyn's gaze flicked to her husband. Ned's pensive features gave away little, but she knew him. He was considering the days ahead, the shape of his role. He was no man for politics, But life had not offered him any easier paths. Next to him, Robert wore a fleeting grin, but it never truly reached his eyes. Perhaps he was thinking of the dead. Or perhaps he was already dreading the responsibilities that came with this crown. The feast lingered for hours. Bowls emptied, cups were refilled. Toast after toast carried the evening forward. Servants brought in fresh logs to keep the fires roaring against the encroaching cold. Every now and then a distant howling echoed through the battlements, the call of wolves in the wintry forest. A reminder that though they feasted on good fortune tonight, darker nights lay ahead. By the time the moon rose high, Robert found himself slipping away from the throng. 2 guards from House Stark, men who had fought bravely in the rebellion, quietly followed him at a respectful distance as he made his way to the courtyard. He pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the bitter cold. His breath misted in front of him. The moon's pale glow illuminated the courtyard, transforming the freshly fallen snow into a silver tapestry. The walls of Winterfell loomed around him. He walked slowly, bootfalls crunching in the snow. Memories fluttered through him, days of riding into battle with Ned at his side, the rush of victory tarnished by heartbreak. His chest felt tight. He could almost hear her voice, the memory so strong it threatened to unman him. Lyanna Stark. The woman he had loved, or had thought he loved. Though perhaps much of that love was shaped by the illusions of youth. He couldn't think of that without tasting bitterness. None of his triumphs brought her back, nor did they undo the tragedies that had fueled their rebellion. He halted in the middle of the courtyard, his eyes drawn to the sky. The swirling clouds revealed and concealed the moon in cyclical intervals. Behind him, the guards stood silent, uncertain if they should offer the new king privacy or stand ready at his back. Robert exhaled sharply and turned, noticing them. "You needn't follow me like shadows," he said, a rough edge in his voice. "A king likes his privacy now and again." The guards exchanged glances, then bowed their heads and kept their distance. They did not leave, but they allowed him space. Robert resumed his slow steps until he found himself beside an old, twisted weirwood tree that grew near the courtyard's edge, its bark bone-white against the gloom. Red leaves rustled overhead like the eyes of watchful gods. He reached out a hand to rest against the trunk, feeling the roughness of ancient bark beneath his palm. He wondered if the old gods were truly watching him now, passing judgment on a man who had spilled so much blood for a love he could not save. The question weighed on him, but he found no answer. Eventually, he let out a low growl of frustration, turning away from the tree. He made his way back to the hall, expression set. For now, he would do what a king must: endure the feasts, the politics, the unending presence of courtiers. Perhaps in time, it would get easier. Or perhaps not. When he re-entered the hall, the music had become gentler. Many guests had departed to find rooms for the night, and only a handful remained chatting quietly. Ned was among them, standing beside the dais, conferring with a few lords, Wyman Manderly, Roose Bolton, and Helmund Tallhart. They straightened as Robert approached, giving small bows. Robert nodded to them. He was no ceremonialist. He was a warrior who preferred laughter and the camaraderie of old friends. But there was an unspoken line now. He was a king, and they were his subjects, however newly minted that relationship might be. Manderly was the first to speak up, folding his large hands over his stomach. "Your Grace, we hope you found the feast to your liking. The North may not offer the opulence of the South, but our hearts are true in hospitality." Robert gave him a grin, albeit a weary one. "You've nothing to worry about, Lord Manderly. You fed me well enough, and your wines tasted better than half the sour swill they serve in the Stormlands. We are well met, all of us." Manderly beamed, obviously relieved. Roose Bolton merely watched with cool eyes, face expressionless, though he offered a dip of his head. Tallhart murmured something about the road ahead, about how the North stood ready. Robert sensed Ned's silent encouragement, so he turned to them, folding his arms across his broad chest. The crown on his head gleamed dully in the torchlight. "We have won a great victory, but the realm is not united. If the North stands behind me, we will need to speak to the Lords of the Vale, the Riverlands, even the Reach, to ensure they share in this new peace. There are many who might balk at the idea of a Baratheon crowned in Winterfell. We should expect to face challenges. They. Manderley pressed his lips together but nodded. Bolton said in a smooth voice, "We have ways of ensuring loyalty, Your Grace. The North remembers who shed blood for this cause and who did not." Robert's eyes flicked to the pale man. "I want no more needless bloodshed," he said quietly but firmly. "We did not cast down the Targaryens only to rule like them. The realm needs peace. Let us show them that this new king can be as just as he is fierce." Nebemazi. Bolton inclined his head, though he said nothing more, leaving Robert to wonder if the man's agreement was truly sincere. A hush passed among them, broken only by Ned, who spoke in his steady, measured tone. "We will meet on the morrow to speak of our next steps. For tonight, let us rest. Winterfell offers guest rooms to all who need them." With that, Manderley, Bolton and Tallhart took their leave. Ned turned to Robert. Exhaustion tugged at the corners of his eyes, but there was still a quiet sense of resolve. "Come," Ned said, placing a hand on Robert's shoulder. "I'll show you to the rooms we've prepared for you." They walked out of the hall together, each step echoing in the corridors that were lit by torches in iron sconces. The hush of night had fully descended upon Winterfell. Most servants had retired, though a few dozed against the walls or hurried to complete last-minute tasks. Robert and Ned made their way up a winding stair. On the landing, a window offered a view of the bailey below, where the light of torches flickered against snowfall. Ned gestured to the sturdy oak door. "Here. It was once my father's solar, but we made it ready for you." Ned Armoines. They entered a warm chamber furnished with a great bed, a hearth, and a table set with candles. Thick tapestries depicting old Stark legends hung on the walls, their gray and white threads weaving stories of winter storms and deerwolves. Robert walked in slowly, taking in the space. Part of him wanted to object. He felt more at home in simpler quarters. But tonight, he was a king, and a king must take a king's chamber. Ned offered him a small smile. "I'll see you in the morning, Robert." The new king nodded in quiet thanks. "Good night, Ned." When Ned left, Robert stood by the hearth, letting the warmth seep into him. He rubbed his temples, feeling a pounding just behind his eyes, equal parts exhaustion and the magnitude of what had happened. For a brief moment, he almost wished they could go back to the days when they were just young men, dreaming of heroic deeds and easy solutions. But war and time had stripped those illusions away. Now he was king, and the North had crowned him. A turn of fate he had never anticipated. He unfastened the crown, setting it gingerly on a low table near the bed. As soon as its weight left his head, he felt a curious sense of relief, but also a pang of emptiness. Could he truly do this? Or would he be crushed by the demands of the position, the same way the Targaryens had been crushed by their own madness and power? The question lingered, but sleep was more insistent. He extinguished the candles and lay down, letting the soft fur-lined blankets envelop him. Eventually, he found the edges of restless slumber, haunted by half-formed dreams of storms, wolves, and a young woman's laugh echoing in the snow. Morning came slowly in the north, with dawn's light filtered through a swirl of gray clouds. Snow continued to flutter from the sky, though lightly. Servants bustled through the corridors, stoking fires, and setting out bread, porridge, and boiled eggs for those awakening from the revels of the previous night. The official matters would begin soon. Councils with northern lords, planning the forging of alliances, and deciding when and how to address the rest of the Seven Kingdoms. Robert stirred from bed, blinking at the pale morning light that seeped in through the narrow window. He rose heavily, momentarily forgetting the presence of the crown until his gaze fell upon it. For a moment, he simply stood there in his small clothes, regarding the thing as though it were a coiled serpent. But he must wear it. He must become it. That was the price of what they had achieved. He dressed in a plain tunic and breeches, slipping on a heavy fur-lined cloak for warmth. The crown he took in hand, though he did not place it on his head just yet. He left the chamber, finding a pair of Stark guards stationed outside. They bowed or saluted, and he inclined his head in return. As he walked the halls, he took in the fortress. Winterfell was older than he could comprehend, its thick walls and winding corridors bearing the ghosts of countless Stark generations. It was a far cry from Storm's End, which had its own imposing architecture, but was shaped by the savage storms of the narrow sea, not by the quiet, unrelenting cold of the north. Eventually he found his way to the great hall, where Ned was seated at a long table with several northern lords. Food was laid out, and they had already begun discussing matters of the day. At Robert's approach, they all stood. That formality still felt strange. He lifted a hand to still them, and took a seat at Ned's side, placing the crown on the table for the moment. Ned cleared his throat. "We were just speaking of riders that must be sent to the Vale. Jon Arryn should hear of this at once." Robert nodded, taking a slice of bread and tearing off a piece. Jon Arryn, his old foster father, the man whose call had rallied him and Ned when the Targaryens had demanded Ned's head. If anyone deserved a voice in the shaping of this new realm, it was Lord Arryn. "He'll understand," Robert said, though a tinge of uncertainty touched his voice. "He's the one who started this in a way. He refused to hand us over to the Mad King. Everything we did after that was forged in his defiance." Lord Umber, a hulking man with a ruddy complexion, took a swig of ale. "Will the Vale support you if they learn the king was crowned in the north? Some might see it as an affront to the traditions of the Iron Throne." Robert pursed his lips. "Jon Arryn is a steadfast man. He won't break faith with us now. But yes, many in the realm might see it as an affront. They'll have to learn that this is how it is." "Bempernadi," Lord Bolton added in his quiet voice. "We should not forget those who remain loyal to the Targaryens. Some scions of that dynasty may yet live across the sea perhaps. There are rumors." A hush greeted that statement. It was no secret that the Mad King's children, if any survived, would have a claim to the throne. On paper anyway. Robert allowed himself a moment of reflection, thinking back to how everything had transpired. The Targaryen family was scattered, but not necessarily entirely destroyed. He did not relish the idea of more bloodshed, but he also knew that any Targaryen survivors would be a threat to his reign. "The Targaryens brought this upon themselves," Robert muttered, glancing at Ned, who looked away as if uneasy. They both knew how events had spiraled from the moment Rhaegar had taken Lyanna. Blood had beget blood, and now the realm was forever changed. The conversation continued, each lord offering his perspective, each pressing for how best to proceed. Letters needed drafting. Ravens needed sending. The realm must know that Robert Baratheon sat the throne. And crucially, they had to figure out if the capital itself would acknowledge him. King's Landing was in disarray. The Lannisters had thrown open its gates at the final hour, but the city's mood was uncertain. Some believed Tywin Lannister seized the chance for power, while others believed it was an act of necessity. The question lingered. Would the Lannisters accept a king crowned in the north, or attempt to bend the situation to their advantage? Robert listened, though he frequently found himself wishing he was out in the yard training or riding through the countryside with a loyal band of companions. He was not made for these lengthy councils. Yet his sense of responsibility, hammered into him by war and loss, kept him in his seat. He did not speak often, leaving Ned to handle the finer points. But when he did speak, his words were direct and occasionally tinged with the impatience of a man who disliked ceremony. The lords exchanged glances at times, unsure whether his bluntness was refreshing or concerning. But they had pledged fealty to him, and so they let their words fall into place around him, shaping the realm's new order bit by bit. When at last they adjourned, Robert left the table with a furrowed brow. Ned followed him out into the courtyard, where the sky had momentarily cleared, allowing a pale winter sun to shine upon the old stones. They walked in silence until they reached the archery range, deserted at this hour. Here, Robert breathed more easily, the crisp air filling his lungs. "That was just the first of many councils," Ned said softly, hugging his cloak around him. "We'll hear from the Riverlands and the Vale soon enough. Then from the Reach and the Westerlands, if all goes well. We'll need your direction, Robert." Robert grimaced, turning to face him. "You know what my direction would be. End these talks, gather all who will swear fealty, and let's focus on rebuilding. Let me handle the threats from any who cling to Targaryen illusions. But do I have to sit through 1,000 more conversations while the realm broods on what might have been?" Ned's expression was laced with sympathy. "A king's burden is not just waging wars, Robert. If we want a stable realm, we need the support of more than swords. We need the laws, the trade, the everyday matters that hold it all together. Mama is in him. Robert sighed, letting his gaze drift to the targets lined up at the far side of the range. Arrows from practice sessions stuck out of them at various angles. I'd almost rather be down there picking up a bow myself, he murmured. Then he turned back to Ned, setting a firm hand on his friend's shoulder. You've always been a steady presence. Can I rely on you to help me with these matters? I may be king, but half these lords speak as though they're weaving riddles. Nea Dali. Ned gave a small smile. You have my word, Robert. We started this together, we'll see it through. A few flakes of snow began to drift once again, swirling in a lazy circle around them. Robert allowed himself a tight nod. At least with Ned at his side, and with the North's loyalty, he felt less like a pretender. The day would be filled with more tasks, more voices demanding his attention. But for now, he found some solace in the crisp morning air. They walked toward the gate of the castle, where the courtyard stretched out in a broad expanse. Stables flanked the walls, and Robert caught the sight of stable boys tending to horses. A sudden desire to ride out, even just for a short distance beyond the walls, stirred within him. He turned to Ned. Send a messenger to gather some men. I wish to ride out, see the land that has given me its crown. Ned didn't protest. He only studied Robert for a heartbeat, then acquiesced with a silent nod. Perhaps he recognized that for Robert to be truly at peace, he would need to feel the wind on his face and the ground under a horse's hooves. They parted ways briefly, Ned going to arrange a small escort, while Robert made his way to the stables. The smell of hay and horseflesh was comforting to him, reminding him of simpler days. Stable hands bobbed their heads in deference as he approached. He selected a sturdy gray destrier, its breath steaming in the cold. With practiced hands, Robert helped the stable boys adjust the saddle and bridle, ignoring their protests that the king need not perform such menial tasks. He needed the familiarity of it. He needed to feel like the man he was, not just a figure in a golden crown. By the time Ned arrived with a handful of guards and a few lesser lords, Robert was already astride the destrier. Snow lay in a fine dusting on the horse's mane. Others mounted swiftly. The gate opened with a groan, and they rode out into the fields beyond Winterfell, cantering through the thin crust of snow that covered the rolling terrain. The chill wind bit at Robert's face, but he relished it, urging his mount forward with quiet mastery. For a moment, in the swift rush of motion, he almost felt free of the crown that weighed on his mind. They passed by patches of woodland, stark branches etched against the sky, and saw small folk going about their tasks, some stopping to stare, half in awe, and half in concern as the new king thundered by with his retinue. What? Robert slowed to greet them, though his words were brief. Some knelt, others simply stood wide-eyed. News of his coronation had surely spread, but likely not all understood what it meant. Robert offered them what warmth he could muster in his voice, telling them the realm would know peace. Yet even as he spoke, he wondered if those promises could truly be kept. They rode on for about an hour, circling back to Winterfell when the clouds began to thicken again. The courtyard seemed different upon their return, as if the walls had grown taller in their absence. Robert dismounted near the stables, handing the reins to a stable boy. He glanced at Ned, who had ridden at his side the entire time. Ned's face was expressionless, but Robert recognized a glint of worry in his friend's eyes. Perhaps Ned feared that Robert would prove ill-suited for the demands of kingship. But the day marched on. More meetings awaited, more careful planning, and more letters to be sent. As the sun reached its zenith, a pale circle in the cloudy sky, Robert found himself once again in the Great Hall, though now it had been rearranged for a council meeting rather than a feast. Lords Manderley, Umber, Bolton, Glover, Serwyn, and others were present, as well as Maester Luwin with fresh parchment and quill in hand. They stood around a large table where a map of the 7 kingdoms was laid out, corners held down with stones. The conversation centered on the messages that needed to be dispatched. The first wave of ravens would go to allies in the Riverlands and the Vale, proclaiming Robert's kingship. Additional letters would go to the Reach, the Westerlands, and even Dorne. Though the mention of Dorne stirred tension in the room, for House Martell had deep-seated grudges from the war, especially after the deaths of Elia and her children. Robert's expression hardened at the mention of Dorne. He knew they would be among the hardest to appease. But a realm could not be stable if an entire region seethed with resentment. Time passed in a blur of discussion. Occasionally, Robert interjected with a decisive statement, drawing from his experiences on the battlefield and his sense of justice. At other times he left the details to Ned and the more administratively minded lords, content to let them shape the intricacies of wording and protocol. He found it draining. By the time the midday meal was served, he realized he was grinding his teeth, restless for a moment of quiet. They broke for the meal in a smaller adjoining chamber. Servants placed bowls of hearty stew and loaves of crusty bread on the table. Robert ate quickly, not from refined manners, but from genuine hunger. A stiff silence had fallen among the northern lords, who seemed content to let him speak first if he wished. Finally, he looked around the table, scanning the group of men he had known mostly through the crucible of war. "We are in this together," Robert said abruptly, setting down his spoon. "I may sit the throne, but I need each of you. The North did not crown me so it could be ignored. Tell me if I'm making missteps. I don't want to become another mad king or a fool lost in illusion." Umber gave a booming laugh, though not unkindly. "Your Grace, if you ever start to show signs of madness, I'm sure the cold winds of the North will snap you back to reason soon enough." A low chuckle rippled around the table. Even Bolton allowed a thin smile. Ned only inclined his head in quiet agreement. Robert felt a subtle warmth in his chest, as though reassured by their solidarity. Perhaps he truly could rely on these men. After the meal, they returned to their tasks. The day wore on, the fire in the hearth growing low, and being refreshed by servants as the hours passed. Outside, night approached, the winter sky turning iron gray as the sun faded early. Robert found himself losing track of time. The responsibilities of kingship were as endless as they were intricate. He scanned parchments with the help of Maester Luwin, learning about the state of roads in the north, the supply of food, the condition of the watchtowers near the wall. Everything seemed to need his attention, and that was only for the north itself. The entire realm lay beyond, teeming with demands. Eventually Ned called the council to a close, sensing the fatigue that had settled in. Robert rose from the table, massaging the back of his neck, feeling the ache of strained muscles. At least once during the afternoon, he had thought of his warhammer, longing for the simpler clarity of battle. Now as he stepped away, he felt a flush of relief. The lords departed, some to their chambers, others to see to the positioning of their men. Robert lingered with Ned in the quiet of the hall. Only a few torches remained lit, throwing flickering shadows on the stone walls. "You'll need a hand," Ned said softly, breaking the silence. "The realm needs a voice that can speak on your behalf, handle many of the daily decisions." Robert arched a brow. "I suppose you're volunteering." Ned gave a faint shrug. "If you ask it of me, I cannot refuse. But remember, my family is here in the north, my people. Still, I would do my duty if you named me." Robert placed a hand on Ned's shoulder, his features weary but sincere. "I value your counsel above all others. You helped me win this war. I'd sooner name you hand than any other. But I can see that your heart belongs to Winterfell." He paused, thinking. "We'll speak more on this tomorrow. There's no rush, but you are my friend, and this realm is in need of wise men, not just loyal ones." Ned nodded, accepting the partial answer. "We can talk more when we've heard back from the rest of the realm. For now, get some rest, Robert. You look like you've been through another battle." Robert offered a tired grin. "That's precisely what this feels like." They parted ways, Ned retreating to his own chambers to find his wife and children. Robert, on the other hand, found himself wandering the corridors once again. This time, the hush of night was full. Most torches had been extinguished, leaving the halls illuminated by only the faint glow of moonlight that seeped through arrow slits and windows. He thought about seeking out a cask of strong ale in the kitchens, perhaps indulging the sort of nightly revel he was once famous for. But instead, he found his way back to his chamber, feeling the pull of exhaustion. Once inside, he shed his cloak, draping it over a chair, and sank onto the edge of the bed. His gaze fell upon the crown, still lying on the table where he had placed it earlier in the day. In the dim light, its mixed metals seemed subdued, as if it too were tired from the day's events. Robert stared at it for a long moment, wrestling with the enormity of what it represented. So much had changed, yet so much remained uncertain. He thought of the men who had died to put him on a throne, of the lords who bent the knee, of the families who had lost sons in battle. He thought of Lyanna, and the echo of her laughter rang once more in his mind. If she were here, how would she regard him now? Would she be proud of his ascension, or would she mourn the further violence it might bring? The question had no easy answer. At length he pulled off his boots and lay back on the bed. He didn't bother lighting a candle. He lay in the dark, eyes closed, listening to the distant sigh of wind against the old stone battlements. He felt the day's strain in every muscle. But when he finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams were deep and formless, offering a respite from the endless questions. Morning came with another layering of fresh snow on Winterfell's roofs. The sky painted a pale pewter. Servants moved through the hallways with hushed efficiency, carrying messages and tending fires. Word had already begun trickling in from the nearest holds, some welcoming, some hesitant. Today would be another day of council, another day of forging the future. Robert rose early, washing quickly with the water left for him, dressing in the warmest clothes he could find. When he finally placed the crown upon his head, he felt a little more acceptance, as though each day wore down his initial shock. Perhaps that was how kings grew into their roles, by wearing the burden day after day, until it no longer felt alien. He emerged into the corridor, where a handful of guards waited. They bowed, but he waved a hand for them to straighten. No need for such formality in these halls, he muttered, though they still maintained a respectful posture. He strode toward the great hall, where he could already hear muted voices. The day's negotiations would begin anew. On the way, he passed Ned's young son, Robb, toddling after his mother. The boy gazed up at Robert with wide eyes, seemingly both frightened and fascinated by the big man with the golden crown. Robert offered him a small, crooked smile, nodding at Catelyn, who returned the gesture. The moment was brief, but it reminded Robert of the future that each generation carried. Perhaps one day that young boy would scarcely remember a time before Robert was king. Perhaps in time, the realm itself would forget the chaos that had birthed this new age, remembering only the stability he hoped to bring. With those thoughts, he stepped into the great hall and took his seat at the head of the table. Ned was already there, and the lords filtered in slowly, greeting him in turn. Raven scrolls lay piled on the tabletop, each one bearing messages from the corners of the realm. Robert felt a flicker of both dread and excitement. Each scroll held new possibilities, alliances, intrigues, threats. He took a deep breath, meeting Ned's eye. The North had crowned him, and he would do what was necessary to uphold that solemn right. If the rest of the Seven Kingdoms wished to challenge him, they would find that Robert Baratheon's wrath was no small thing. If they wished to join him, they would find a king determined to unite and heal the land. Only time would tell which path the realm would follow. So began the long hours of reading messages, discussing responses, and setting them to parchment for the ravens to carry. From the Vale, an encouraging note from Lord Arryn, though it carried a request for an immediate meeting in the Eyrie to clarify the security of the realm. From the Riverlands, a reticent but generally positive acceptance of Robert's rule, no doubt influenced by House Tully's connections to Ned. From the Westerlands, a measured statement from Lord Tywin Lannister, couched in polite language that promised cautious support, while also hinting at terms to be negotiated. Robert read the Lannister message twice, frowning at its ambiguous phrasing. He could sense the cunning behind the words, the measured civility that hid deeper intentions. "We'll need to handle Tywin with care," he muttered. "He's no friend, and his gold could turn the tide if he chooses to oppose us." Ned nodded in agreement. At least he threw the gates open at the end, preventing further bloodshed in King's Landing. But I do not doubt he did it for his own gain. The day wore on, and Robert felt his patience stretched. Men came and went, offering advice or seeking it. The North had never been the seat of the Iron Throne, yet now they moved to shape the fate of all 7 kingdoms from these chilly halls. By dusk, Robert rose from the table, his stomach rumbling and his mind aching. He glanced out a narrow window and saw the darkening sky. Another day had slipped by in the intricacies of rule. But the nights in Winterfell offered small comforts: a hearty meal, a few cups of strong ale, and a fire that kept the worst of the cold at bay. Robert found himself in a smaller dining room that evening with Ned, Catelyn, and a select few others. The meal was modest but warm, thick with the flavors of the North. Conversation drifted to simpler topics, like the lay of the land around Winterfell, and small anecdotes about the younger Stark children. Robert allowed the tensions of the day to ebb. For a few minutes, he almost felt like the old Robert again, the one who could spin a bawdy tale or laugh at life's absurdities without worrying about the shape of a kingdom. Eventually, though, he excused himself from the table, feeling the need for solitude. Ned understood, offering only a quiet, respectful nod. Robert left the small group, slipping outside into the courtyard once more. This time, the cold seemed sharper, the wind more insistent. Stars glittered above, scattered across the sky, and the moon hung low over the battlements. The silence felt heavier. Guards stood on the walls, torches casting orange halos in the gloom. With measured steps, Robert made his way through the courtyard and found himself at Winterfell's Godswood, the ancient place of worship for the old gods. He slipped through the gate, following the worn path into the grove where the heart tree stood. Snow clung to the branches, and the quiet hush of the grove enveloped him. He approached the weirwood, its pale bark reflecting the moonlight, and stood before it. A red face seemed carved into the trunk, its eyes weeping red sap like tears of blood, an eternal symbol of the North's spiritual ties. He lingered there for several minutes, his breath misting in the still air. He had been raised to follow the faith of the Seven, but here in the North, something about the old gods resonated with him. Perhaps it was the simplicity, the primal sense of something older than crowns and wars. He found himself speaking in a low whisper, though he wasn't sure if he was speaking to the tree or to his own memories. "Lyanna," he murmured, shutting his eyes. "They crowned me here, where you lived, the North, your home. I hope I make this a realm that would honor your memory, not tarnish it." The wind in the branches offered no reply. But in the silence, Robert felt a faint sense of acceptance, or perhaps that was just the hush of night. He opened his eyes, the taste of old sorrow lingering in his throat. War had shaped him into a man who could carry a kingdom on his shoulders, but it had also taken part of his soul. Maybe that was the price. He turned away from the heart tree, letting the crisp air wrap around him. The night was cold, but he felt a fire within, a mixture of determination, grief, and the stubborn will that had earned him victory on the battlefield. He would see this kingship through. The North had given him its blessing, and he would not fail it. Perhaps one day, the snows would thaw, and the realm would find peace under the crown of Robert Baratheon, the king crowned in Winterfell. For now, though, he would take it one step at a time, one breath at a time, forging a kingdom worthy of the sacrifices made. He made his way out of the Godswood, heading back toward the keep. Tomorrow, he would rise again to face the challenges of uniting a realm still raw from war. He would wear the crown, meet with lords, plan for the eventual journey to King's Landing, or wherever duty called him. He would do all of this because he must, for Lyanna's memory, for Ned's sake, and for all those who had believed in him. Step by step, he would fulfill the promise that the North had given him. For now, night wrapped Winterfell in its quiet embrace, and the newly crowned king sought what little sleep he could find, ready to meet another day with all the strength that still lived in his battered heart. Ka. Darkness arrived in Winterfell with a gentle wind that shifted through the trees in the Godswood, rustling red leaves with a faint whispering sound. For a short while, Robert slept soundly, his exhausted mind sinking into untroubled blackness. Then, as the hours wore on, flickers of agitation nibbled at the edges of his rest. He dreamt of the trident's rushing waters, of thunderous hooves and the gleam of Rhaegar Targaryen's armor. He felt once again the hammer's weight in his hands, saw the flash of steel, and the explosion of ruby-bright light in the swirling current. He jerked awake in the pre-dawn gloom, chest heaving, the echo of the dream still pulsing in his ears. He sat up slowly, beads of sweat along his brow. The chill of the northern night clung to his skin, and the chamber's hearth had burned low, its embers reduced to a sullen glow. He stared across the dim room until he found the crown resting on a nearby table, a ghostly shape in the lack of light. The sight of it summoned a heavy swell in his chest, both pride and an ache of responsibility. With a long breath he rose from the bed, padding barefoot across the cold stone floor to stir the fire back to life. A few minutes of coaxing the embers, adding split logs, and the flames began to lick upward again, crackling their quiet greeting to a new day. Robert ran a hand through his hair, thinking of how it might look when others saw him at first light. The disheveled warrior king, wide-shouldered, eyes ringed with sleeplessness, weighed down by ghosts of battles past. He tried not to dwell on it. Instead, he forced himself to focus on the morning's duties. There would be lords awaiting him at dawn, no doubt, and the constant flow of ravens carrying word from across the realm. He must stand before them all, every inch the king he had vowed to be. The sun had barely begun to streak the sky with pale color when the soft knock came at the chamber door. A servant entered, carrying a bowl of steaming water and a cloth. Robert allowed him to set it down, though he had half a mind to wave off the fuss. Yet he recognized that kings were expected to maintain certain appearances. He washed quickly, splashing the warm water over his face. By the time he'd dressed in a thick doublet and pulled on boots lined with fur, he heard movement outside. Footsteps of the Stark guards assigned to him, hushed voices of those tending to the keep. He buckled his sword belt at his waist, then hesitated, eyeing the crown. He picked it up with careful fingers, letting its weight settle in his hands. It felt colder than he remembered. The gold and iron blended, forging a stark representation of the new monarchy, a meeting of southern glamour and northern grit. Exhaling softly, he set it on his head. In the corridor, the day's bustle was already gaining momentum. The servants who bowed or curtsied to Robert as he passed did so with a blend of curiosity and reverence. He imagined that for many of them, the idea of a king living day by day under Winterfell's roof was a novelty. Kings in the north were of ancient legend, from a time before the Targaryens claimed dominion over the whole realm. Perhaps, Robert mused grimly, they were about to step back into legend once again. He made his way toward the Great Hall, where a handful of men-at-arms in stark livery greeted him with respectful nods. Inside, the hall was slowly being transformed from the solemn hush of night to the pragmatic business of morning. The long tables had been cleared of last night's cups and plates. A few braziers cast warm halos. Seated at one of the trestle tables was Ned Stark, already conferring quietly with Maester Luwin. At the sight of Robert, Ned rose, pressing a set of parchments into the maester's hands, then gave a short bow. "Good morning," Ned said, voice low. "I trust you found at least a few hours of rest." Robert offered a nod that might have been agreement, though a faint sigh escaped him. "I slept," he replied, "but was visited by old memories." He cast a glance at the parchments. "What news do we have?" Maester Luwin cleared his throat in that polite way of his. "A raven from River Run, your grace. Lord Hoster Tully sends word of his intention to recognize your claim, though he wishes for further assurances that the Riverlands will be duly rewarded for their loyalty. There is also a missive from the Vale. Lord Arryn has written to say he'll gladly meet, either here or at the Eyrie, to discuss the formalities of your coronation and the matter of a new hand." The maester paused. "Several more letters are from minor lords of the north, offering their fealty and requesting audiences." Robert grunted. "Hoster Tully will want to secure his bloodline's influence." "Fair enough. Jon Arryn is a friend as well as my foster father, so that should be easier to navigate." He rubbed a hand over his face. "Though truth be told, I'd rather ride to the Eyrie than host a swarm of men here. I feel caged already." Ned offered a faint grimace. "The roads are still dangerous, especially if there's any hidden pocket of Targaryen loyalists lying in wait. But if you truly wish to leave Winterfell and meet with Lord Arryn, we can arrange for a sufficient escort. Still, it might be wise to wait until we've heard from the Westerlands as well. Tywin Lannister's stance will impact how you travel through the Riverlands to reach the Vale." Ned Shatton. Robert knew Ned was right. The North might have crowned him, But the rest of the realm still balanced between acceptance and potential rebellion. He needed to weigh each decision carefully, as much as the old warrior in him chafed at caution. "You speak sense," he admitted grudgingly, and turned to the maester. "Let's send a response to Lord Aaron. Tell him I'll soon desire a meeting, likely here, if traveling to the Eyrie proves unwise. Also prepare a reply to Lord Hoster Tully, ensuring him we value his loyalty." Lewin bowed, eyes gleaming with diligence. "Of course, Your Grace. I'll see to it at once." The rest of the morning slipped away in a series of visits from Northmen who had begun to gather outside Winterfell's walls. Some arrived with small retinues, bringing tokens of fealty. A cask of mead, a carved figure from the old gods, a handful of battered men who had bled for the cause and sought recognition. Robert attempted to greet each with courtesy and a measure of gratitude. It was strange, seeing the lines of men who considered him not just a fellow rebel, but now a king upon whom their fortunes depended. They told him stories of what the North had endured in the war, how their families had been torn, how their holdings had survived in the face of Targaryen retribution. These were sobering tales, and Robert felt the pressing responsibility in each face that looked to him for a better future. By midday, Robert was weary. The hall never seemed to empty, and the swirl of voices, the shuffle of boots on stone, the echoes of every conversation weighed heavily on him. At one point, Lady Maege Mormont arrived, wrapped in a thick cloak of bearskin, and she offered her own curt vow to the new king. She was direct, speaking with the unvarnished frankness of the North. "Bear Island stands with House Stark," she declared. "And if Lord Stark has chosen you as our king, then we'll stand with you. Just see that you don't forsake us as so many southern kings have done." Robert assured her as best he could, meeting the hard glint in her eyes. He had no illusions that Maege Mormont was the sort to forgive broken promises lightly. After the day's formalities, the late afternoon found Robert stepping away from the throng. He left Ned to manage a few final supplicants and retreated down a side corridor, looking for some quiet. Light filtered through narrow windows, and torches along the walls gave off a soft glow. He felt a pulse of relief, just to be alone with his thoughts for a moment. Each footstep led him past ancient Stark tapestries, their direwolves running through thick woven snowscapes. The raw smell of old stone and flickering torch smoke mingled in the air. He found himself at the entrance to a small courtyard, one lined with the storied arches of Winterfell's older sections. Within it, a blacksmith's forge was set up under a wooden awning, and he heard the distant clang of metal on metal. The sound was steady and practiced, a comforting echo of labor. Robert followed the noise until he came upon a smith hammering out a horseshoe, sparks dancing each time the hammer struck. When the man looked up and spotted Robert, he started to bow hastily, but Robert gestured for him to go on. He approached, letting the warmth of the forge wash over him. The scent of molten steel, an oddly welcome reminder of simpler times. In another life, Robert might have lingered here longer, chatting about the forging of weapons, the shape of a warhammer, the best method to temper steel. But a swirl of thoughts about kingly duties broke the momentary calm. He studied the embers, bright like miniature suns, and remembered the battlefield forge that had heated the metal for his own hammer before the rebellion. A weapon that had cracked Rhaegar Targaryen's chestplate in the rush of water and blood. The memory briefly tightened his throat. So much had changed. He was no longer free to roam battlefields as a lord hungry for righteous vengeance. Now, every step was watched, every word weighed. With a final nod to the blacksmith, Robert turned away, tension simmering beneath his skin. A short while later, he found Ned waiting for him in a drafty corridor that overlooked the courtyard. Ned's expression told him there was no chance of respite just yet. "My lord," Ned said, as though he still preferred addressing Robert informally. "I've word that a small party from the Dreadfort arrived not long ago, and they wish to see you." Robert let out a low breath, thinking of Roose Bolton, who possessed a reputation for quiet cunning that made many uneasy. "I'll see them," he said, resigned. "But let's keep this brief, Ned. I fear my patience is wearing thin." They made their way back to the great hall. The light of day had begun to tilt toward dusk, the shadows lengthening across the stone floor. At the far end of the hall, near the dais, a trio of men in Bolton colors stood at a disciplined attention. When Robert approached, they bowed. One, older and lean, stepped forward. He had the pallor typical of men from those chilly northern climes, and his eyes glinted with a certain sharpness. "Your Grace," the man said in a smooth voice, "I come bearing tidings from the Dreadfort. Lord Bolton sends his felicitations on your coronation and humbly requests the honor of your presence at a gathering of northern lords, to be held on the Dreadfort grounds in a fortnight. If your duties permit, he wishes to ensure unity among the houses, that we might act swiftly should any Targaryen loyalists resurface." Namtahan. Robert exchanged a quick look with Ned. He was not blind to Bolton's self-interest. A gathering could serve as a show of loyalty, or it could be a chance for the Dreadfort to assert influence. Still, in the precarious climate of the newly established monarchy, it might be wise to keep the Boltons close. "Tell Lord Bolton I appreciate the invitation," Robert answered. "I will consider it, once I gauge the demands of the realm. The day may come when I travel south before I can visit every northern seat. For now, know that I do not forget those who helped us win this war." The Bolton envoy inclined his head in acceptance. "As you say, Your Grace, we are at your service. I'll bear your reply to my lord." Robert nodded briskly, eager for the men to depart. He watched as they turned on their heels and left in measured steps, their boots echoing over the stones. He suppressed a shiver. Something about them made the back of his neck prickle. Ned's voice, low, drew him from his thoughts. "You don't have to go to the Dreadfort if you'd rather not," he said. "No one expects the king to attend every meeting. But ignoring such invitations can foster resentment, especially from a house that's always required a firm hand." There was a note of caution in his tone. Robert flexed his jaw. "I know," he muttered. "I'll weigh it. I'm not so green that I don't recognize how quickly alliances can shift. The Boltons might keep the peace now, but if they sense weakness, they'll press it." As the last of the day's visitors took their leave, Robert felt an ache in his head, a dull pounding that matched the exhausted lines etched in his face. He longed for a cup of ale, something to burn away the dryness in his throat. One glance around the hall, though, told him that a fresh wave of tasks might still be waiting. Even if the petitioners had gone, the realm's affairs did not vanish. He resolved that after supper, he would seek the quiet of his chamber again, or perhaps find Ned to share a moment of calm. Night fell quickly, a velvet drape over the fortress. Torches and lanterns flared around Winterfell's walls, revealing spirals of snow drifting lazily downward. Inside, a modest supper had been arranged in a smaller dining room for Robert, Ned, and Catelyn, as well as a few of Ned's bannermen. As they settled around the table, the murmur of conversation was subdued. Robert tasted warm soup that carried the faint tang of herbs from the greenhouse, followed by fresh bread still steaming from the oven. He noted the quiet scraping of utensils, the rustle of Catelyn's skirts, the subtle glances the bannermen exchanged when he, the king, reached for his ale. Eventually, Ned cleared his throat. "I've had a letter from Benjen," he said, tone thoughtful. "He's at the wall, as you know. The Night's Watch is stretched thin, though that's not new. He writes that rumors abound of strange sightings in the far north. Wolves too large to be normal, fires seen at night. It's likely just old stories, but still, he wanted us aware." "Namjay." Robert frowned. "A realm never lacks for rumors, does it?" He swirled his ale, remembering old tales told by northerners about the lands beyond the wall. Myths of wights and giants, the stuff of songs. If the Watch truly needs assistance, we can send some measure of help. But the realm is rebuilding from war. Resources might be limited. Catelyn folded her hands, her manner composed. "We'll consider it carefully," she said gently. "But first, we should see how the crown's coffers stand. With King's Landing in disarray, I fear finances may be precarious." She smiled politely, but there was caution in her eyes. Robert recognized her point. The Targaryen treasury had likely been pillaged or scattered in the chaos. Tywin Lannister, ever the opportunist, might have seized gold. Even House Redwyne or other lords could have withheld taxes while the crown was in flux. "We can't ignore the Watch," he said. "But we must ensure we don't promise what we can't deliver." Send a raven to Benjen. Have him detail precisely what they need. After we hear from the other great houses, maybe we'll have a better idea. Menes. The meal continued in uneasy quiet. When at last Robert retired from the table, he felt a thrum of restlessness coursing through him. The day had been full of duties, yet his mind still roamed with unvoiced questions. He left the small dining room and strode alone down the corridor, half glad none of Ned's bannermen lingered to pester him. Lantern light flickered on the walls, shadows dancing at the corners of his vision. He walked aimlessly, following the winding corridors until he found himself at a small interior courtyard. The chill winter air rushed at him the moment he stepped out through the arched doorway. Snow gathered in the corners, glinting faintly beneath a half moon. He heard the distant howls of direwolves, or perhaps only the north wind. He breathed in the cold, letting it sharpen his thoughts. For a moment in the hush, he recalled how once in the Stormlands he had roamed the castle's ramparts at night, listening to the sea's roar and the wind's keen whistle. That memory felt like it belonged to another man, a man who had not seen half his friends die in a war, who had not lost the woman he thought he loved. He exhaled, frustration mingling with longing. A soft voice behind him broke his reverie. "My lord." He turned and found Catelyn Stark standing there, arms clasped around herself for warmth. Her auburn hair shimmered in the moonlight. She inclined her head. "Forgive me for intruding, but I saw you leave. I wish to be sure you were well." Robert studied her, seeing genuine concern in her eyes. He realized she was likely worried for Ned as well, or for the realm that had placed so much hope in him. He offered a small, crooked smile. "I'm fine," he murmured, though the answer was half-hearted. "This place, Winterfell. Somehow it makes me feel the weight of everything more keenly, but also, there's a kind of comfort in it." She nodded, stepping close enough that her voice remained low. "The North can be harsh, but it's steadfast in ways other parts of the realm are not. I've come to appreciate that, living here as a Tully bride. You'll find the people here loyal if you keep faith with them. And they look to you now. Each day, they'll look to you a bit more." "Amen." He let out a breath that fogged in the cold. "A king's burden, I suppose, though I never expected to be one in this manner. I thought would dethrone the Targaryens, place me on the Iron Throne in King's Landing, and that would be that. Instead, I find myself crowned in the north, with half the realm still uncertain, and the memory of the war is fresh in all our minds." He stopped, uncertain why he was admitting so much. Perhaps it was something about Catelyn's calm presence, or simply the lateness of the hour. She gently placed a hand on his arm. "The realm needs healing. You and Ned have been through so much. If the north is where that healing begins, so be it. In time, the rest of Westeros may come to see you as the rightful king, perhaps even a good one." "A good one," he echoed softly, gazing at the moonlit stones beneath his feet. Did he deserve that title? He had taken Rhaegar's life on the battlefield, hammered it out of him in a swirl of blood and water. Many had cheered that blow, but the cost lingered. "Let's hope so." She inclined her head once more, then excused herself with a gentle murmur about seeing to her children. Robert watched her depart, footsteps quiet against the snowy stones. In the hush that followed, he gathered himself, letting a steady breath fill his lungs. Then he turned back inside, heading for the bedchamber that was now his. The corridor felt longer, and each step heavier, until at last he entered, finding the familiar quiet waiting within. He removed the crown, placed it aside, and lowered himself to the bed. Though his mind whirled with reflections, fatigue eventually claimed him, and he slipped into a dark, dreamless slumber. He woke to the gray hush of dawn, servants bringing fresh water and stoking the fire. He washed and dressed in silence, bracing himself for another day's demands. As he emerged into the corridor, the unusual hush set him on edge. A guard approached, offering a bow. "Your Grace, Lord Stark asks for your presence in the Solar at once. There's been a raven." Robert felt his pulse quicken. The guard's tone was subdued, but urgent. He stepped forward, forcing calm into his voice. "Lead on." They wound through a narrow stairwell to the Solar, a cozy chamber warmed by a fire. Ned was there, clad in a plain tunic, Catelyn at his side, her brow furrowed. Standing near the window was Maester Luwin, a small scroll in his hand. The expression on the maester's face was grave. Robert shut the door behind him, the hinges groaning in the silent tension. "What news?" Robert asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Ned gestured for Luwin to read. The maester slipped on a pair of thin reading lenses and cleared his throat. "Your Grace, Lord Stark, this is from King's Landing, specifically from the commander of the City Watch, who has apparently taken it upon himself to send ravens in the absence of stable governance. He writes that the Lannisters have been making overtures of control within the city, seizing certain positions of power. There are rumors that Tywin Lannister considers taking custody of the Red Keep in his family's name until the rightful king arrives to claim it." Robert's jaw tightened. So Tywin is making his move. Are we sure the commander can be trusted? He recalled hearing that the City Watch often swayed with the strongest force present. Ned's eyes darkened. It's possible this is an honest plea, or it could be a Lannister ploy. But if Tywin is consolidating power in King's Landing, he means to make your path to the throne on your terms more complicated. He might claim to hold the city for you, but that's a precarious arrangement. Catelyn's voice was quiet, yet firm. "Perhaps it's time you sent an envoy, someone to speak with Lord Tywin, or keep an eye on what's happening there. If we let the Lannisters tighten their grip, we'll lose the advantage of setting your rule in place smoothly." "D." Robert nodded, brow furrowed. "A. We can't let the Lannisters fortify themselves in the capital unopposed. But who do we send? I don't want any fool losing his head the moment he sets foot in the Red Keep." There was a pregnant pause. Luwin looked at Ned, who lowered his gaze, clearly contemplating. "I'd go myself," Ned began slowly. "But my family is here, and you need my counsel in the north. Perhaps we can find a lord well respected by the Lannisters, or at least not openly despised by them. One who can travel with enough men to stay safe, yet not so many it provokes them." "No." Robert raked a hand through his dark hair. "We'll think on it," he said at last, voice tight. "We can't let Tywin have free reign in King's Landing. The Iron Throne stands empty, and I'm the man who must fill it, crowned or no. But if I travel south now, half the realm might view it as an invasion rather than a rightful claim. The North's coronation unsettles them enough already." Ned inclined his head. "We could secure more alliances first, see how the Vale, the Riverlands, and others respond. Then ride south with a proper host, ensuring no confusion, or at least less confusion." Robert felt a coil of tension in his gut. Every path bristled with risks. If he waited too long, Tywin could entrench himself in the capital, forging alliances with those who valued gold more than loyalty. Yet riding south in haste might spark open conflict. The realm was tired of war, and he did not want another battle for King's Landing. He sank into a chair, the wood groaning beneath his powerful frame. "We'll compose a letter to Tywin," he said, voice grim. "Something firm, letting him know I am king, crowned in the north, but that we do not seek further bloodshed. I'll emphasize that the Iron Throne is mine by right of conquest and by the realm's acceptance. We'll see how he responds." He glanced at Luwin. "Also, a message to the City Watch commander, stating that I intend to come south in due time, and that stability must be maintained for the good of the city. We can't have a rabble or a Lannister stranglehold." Maester Luwin nodded. "I'll prepare both ravens immediately." Ned's mouth curved in a thoughtful line. "You might consider writing Lord Arryn too. He could travel to King's Landing with the strength of the Vale behind him, ensuring Tywin doesn't seize complete control before your arrival. Jon is well respected, even by the Lannisters, or at least not openly hated." Robert sat forward. "A fair idea. But I have to be certain Jon stands ready to risk a confrontation. I won't throw him to the lions unprepared." "Ask him," Ned said simply. "He was the one who risked all to protect us in the beginning. He might do so again." Narrow, quiet tension settled over the solar. Robert nodded, mind churning. He pushed to his feet, crossing to the fireplace, where a small flame danced over fresh logs. He gazed into it for a moment, letting the crackle fill the silence. The Targaryens had once ruled from that city with fire and blood. Now Tywin Lannister, cunning as any lion, threatened to overshadow the rightful claim. Robert set his jaw. He would not be overshadowed. He had hammered Rhaegar into the waters of the Trident, and he would not yield his newly forged crown. Turning back to Ned, he said, "Let's write to Jon Arryn as well. We have to move carefully, but we cannot stand idle. And once we've got these letters dispatched, we'll gather the lords we trust and decide the next steps." His voice held a steady note of resolve. They broke from the meeting soon after, each with tasks. Ned to speak with the lords about mustering men, Luwin to draft letters for swift dispatch, and Catelyn to oversee domestic concerns in Winterfell. Robert lingered in the solar a moment longer, letting the echo of their conversation settle in the rafters. At last, he exhaled and left, stepping out into the corridor, where the daily bustle resumed its hold. He soon found himself outside in the courtyard, seeking a slice of winter air to clear his head. Snow had begun drifting from a steel-gray sky. The hush it brought was curiously soothing, as if all the turmoil roiling in his mind was muffled by the gentle fall of flakes. Guards stood on the walls, watchful. Robert wondered if they ever suspected that the greatest battles sometimes raged within a leader's heart, rather than on a battlefield. Movement to his left caught his eye. Theon Greyjoy, the ward of House Stark, was practicing archery with a few of Ned's household guard. The boy, nearing manhood, with a sly grin, loosed arrows at a straw target, each shot landing with a satisfying thunk. Theon noticed Robert's presence and offered a quick, somewhat cocky smile, raising his bow in a gesture of greeting. Robert dipped his head in return, a tight smile on his lips. Though the boy was a ward, he carried the seafaring blood of the Iron Islands, a place that had risen in rebellion against the Iron Throne before. Another corner of the realm that demanded constant vigilance. Near Theon, a younger Stark boy named Bran was watching with bright curiosity. Though the boy was not yet old enough to join the archery session, his eyes shone, reflecting both excitement and longing. Robert felt a small pang of nostalgia. He'd been about that age when he first learned to hold a weapon properly under the watchful eyes of his own mentors. He turned away and let his gaze travel along the courtyard's length. The swirling flakes descended like quiet blessings, covering footprints and tracks from earlier in the day. He headed toward the stables, driven by an instinctive yearning to ride again, if only for a while. The stable hands recognized him instantly and hurried to ready a horse. Before long, he was astride the same sturdy gray destrier, the crown left behind in his chamber. He had no intention of dislodging it on a gallop outside the walls. Instead, he wore a thick cloak, lined with fur around the collar, and simple leather gloves. Escorted by 2 Stark guards, Robert urged the destrier through Winterfell's gates, crossing the lower drawbridge into the open fields that stretched beyond. The sky was a monochrome canvas of cloud, and the wind rustled drifts of snow over the path. He and his escort rode in a line, hooves crunching through the thin crust of ice. A hush lay over the fields, broken only by the muffled jingle of bridles and the distant caw of crows. They didn't venture too far, for the day's tasks called, and the roads could be treacherous. But the half hour spent outside Winterfell's walls breathed some semblance of life back into Robert. As though the north's cold air scoured away layers of burden, he found a brief reprieve in the rhythm of the horse's gait, in the sight of leafless trees standing stark against the snowy horizon. Here was the land that had crowned him by the will of its lords, a land that demanded a certain hardness from those who claimed to rule it. When they turned back toward Winterfell, Robert spotted small folk laboring to clear a path. They paused and bowed clumsily at the sight of him. Robert lifted a hand in acknowledgement. He felt the weight of their expectations, the silent question in their eyes. Would this new king truly protect them, govern them justly, ensure that the devastation of war would not return? Back in the courtyard, he dismounted near the stables, handing the reins to a stable boy with quiet gratitude. The world inside Winterfell's walls resumed its rhythm. Men going about tasks, ravens fluttering in and out of the rookery, the clang of steel from the training yard. Robert rubbed his gloved hands, glancing up at the keep's towers. The air tasted of snow and possibility. He walked across the courtyard and entered the great hall, where a smaller gathering had formed around Ned. They were discussing something in hushed voices, but parted to let Robert through. Ned offered him a nod, then turned to the men. "His Grace is here," he said simply, and the men bowed. Robert recognized them as a delegation from House Glover of Deepwood, Mott. Their spokesman, a broad-shouldered man with a neatly trimmed beard, explained they had come to pledge fealty in person. They also requested the Crown's assistance in fortifying Deepwood Mott against future raids from the western coast, an echo of the old Ironborn threat that lingered in Northerners' minds. Robert listened intently, though inside, he couldn't help marveling at the volume of tasks that piled up for a king. Fortifications, alliances, finances, and now the swirling worry about Tywin Lannister in King's Landing. He gave the Glovers a measured answer, promising to consider their needs once the immediate matters were sorted. They bowed, satisfied enough for the time being, and departed. Only then did Robert exhale. Ned touched his arm lightly, urging him aside. "How fare you?" Ned asked quietly, once they were alone near the dais. Robert clasped his friend's shoulder. "I'm managing," he said, voice low. "Though every hour, I feel the realm's burdens stack higher. I'll do what must be done. Just remind me now and again that I am still Robert Baratheon, not just a puppet dancing on a string of power." A ghost of a smile touched Ned's lips. "I'll remind you, my friend. But you do seem to be wearing the crown more comfortably each day. The lords notice your resolve. Word is spreading that you command respect, even if the crowning happened here, rather than in the south." "Me?" Robert snorted softly. "Respect or fear? Perhaps both." He glanced at the empty dais, where the carved weirwood chair still sat, a reminder of the oath the North had sworn. "We'll manage. For now, let's draft those letters to Tywin, to the City Watch, and to Jon Arryn. Once they're sent, we'll see what the rest of the realm has to say." Ned nodded, gesturing for Robert to follow him. They moved toward one of the side chambers, a warmer, smaller room fitted with a table and chairs, where Maester Luwin awaited them. The Maester had fresh parchment unrolled, quills and ink set neatly in place. Robert settled into a chair, scanning the candlelit room. The air smelled of parchment and melting wax. They worked through the first letter methodically. To Tywin Lannister, Robert set a firm yet measured tone, acknowledging House Lannister's resources and urging cooperation rather than unilateral control over King's Landing. He made it clear that the seat of power now rested with the king crowned in the north, but that he invited Lord Tywin to join him in restoring stability to the realm. A diplomatic approach, though Robert privately suspected Tywin would read between the lines. He was effectively warning the Lannisters not to overreach, but offering them a place if they did not challenge his claim. Next came the letter to the City Watch's commander, reaffirming that Robert Baratheon was indeed king, recognized by the North, and that he expected the City Watch to maintain peace in King's Landing until he arrived, or sent a duly authorized representative. The letter carried an undercurrent of threat, but also reassurance. Robert wanted no riots, no bloodshed, if it could be helped. Finally, the missive to Jon Arryn. Robert wrote in more personal terms, addressing Jon as a trusted mentor who had risked all to defy the Mad King. He explained the situation, the concerns about Tywin's movements in the capital, and humbly asked Jon's support in either traveling to King's Landing to stabilize matters or coming to Winterfell for further discussion. Robert left the choice open, emphasizing that he trusted Jon's judgment and loyalty above most others. Each letter was sealed with the newly minted sigil, a crown entwined with a stag and dire wolf motif, symbolizing Baratheon rule and Northern Alliance. Luwin prepared the ravens, ensuring they carried the messages to their respective destinations. Robert felt a wave of relief watching the master depart with the scrolls in a leather pouch. At least he had taken some tangible steps, rather than merely wrestling with intangible concerns. By that time, dusk pressed against the windows, painting the sky in muted grays and blues. Servants bustled in to light more candles in the hearth. Ned and Robert remained in the chamber, each lost in thought. Robert traced a finger along the grain of the wooden table, remembering all the times they had huddled over rough maps during the war, planning strikes against the Targaryen loyalists. Then, they had fought side by side, fueled by camaraderie and a sense of just cause. Now, the battlefields were replaced by letters, seals, and negotiations. A soft rap on the door signaled Catelyn's arrival. She stepped in, quietly setting a wooden tray with cups of mulled wine on the table. The steam curled upward, carrying the sweet, spiced scent. Ned stood to greet her, and she offered him a small smile before turning to Robert. "Drink, both of you," she said gently. "There's still some warmth to be found at day's end." Robert thanked her, lifting one of the cups. The wine's warmth spread down his throat, easing the stiffness in his body. Ned sipped as well, inhaling the aroma. For a few moments no one spoke. The hush felt comforting rather than awkward. Robert leaned back in his chair, letting the tension seep out of his shoulders. "We've done what we can for now," Ned said quietly. "The realm's next moves depend on the responses we get. If Tywin stands down, or at least pretends to, we might buy ourselves time. If he ignores us, or worse, declares open hostility, we'll have no choice but to act." "You and dear." Robert nodded, gazing into the swirling wine in his cup. "And if Jon Arryn can help hold King's Landing," he said, "we'll be in a far better position. The men of the Vale are no trifling matter, and Jon is wise enough to keep the Lannisters in check." He set the cup down, turning to Catelyn. "I only hope we can resolve this without plunging the realm into another war. The people have shed enough blood." Catelyn met his gaze, sincerity shining in her blue eyes. "We all hope for the same, Your Grace. The last rebellion cost too many lives. Perhaps under your rule, the realm will know a measure of peace." "Nezer." Robert closed his eyes briefly, the memory of Lyanna stirring in the back of his mind. He wondered if peace would ever truly come, or if that was just another dream doomed to be broken by the harsh reality of men's ambitions. Still, he found comfort in the thought that he might at least try. He was king now. He had the power, the authority. With Ned's help, with the loyalty of the North, perhaps he could steer the realm away from the worst of tyrannies. They lingered in the glow of the hearth a bit longer, sipping mulled wine until the tray was empty. Catelyn excused herself to attend to her children. Ned remained, silent and thoughtful, by Robert's side. The flickering firelight danced across their faces, highlighting the lines etched by responsibility. When at last Robert rose to take his leave, he felt the day's exhaustion return. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Perhaps the Ravens would carry more urgent news, or some new turn would force his hand. But for the moment, there was nothing more to be done. "Get some rest, Ned," he said softly, clasping his friend's arm. "You've done enough labor for 10 men. Ned inclined his head, though he lingered by the fire. "Good night, Robert." Robert departed into the corridor, where the torches were kept low. He felt each step in his bones, an odd mixture of weariness and determination. In his chamber, he undressed by the pale light of a single candle, folding away his cloak and setting his sword aside. The crown sat upon a wooden chest at the foot of the bed, glinting faintly, a constant reminder of the burden he had taken on. He lay down, the bed's blankets cool against his skin. The quiet of the chamber pressed in around him, and for a moment, he almost expected another flood of old memories. Nightmares of the Trident, or the face of Rhaegar Targaryen at the moment of death. Yet the swirling thoughts seemed more subdued tonight, replaced by a steady resolve that tomorrow, he would continue forging his path. He would lead the realm carefully through the maze of alliances and simmering tensions, trusting in the North's strength and in the loyalty he had earned on the battlefield. Slowly his mind drifted toward a gentler darkness, and sleep claimed him. When morning came, he awoke to find a thin, wintry sunlight peeking through the shutters. The day began anew, and he rose once more, repeating the motions that had already grown routine: washing, dressing, retrieving the crown, and setting it upon his head. A guard came to summon him to the great hall, where Ned, Maester Luwin, and several lords awaited. They were eager to discuss further plans, the readiness of troops, the watch on the roads, and the possibility of receiving visitors from the Riverlands who might arrive any day now to pay respects. Robert sat at the head of the table, the flicker of torches reflecting off the gold and iron crown. He listened to the men present, occasionally interjecting with questions or directives. It felt a little more natural than it had on the first day of his coronation. He was still a warrior at heart, but he was growing accustomed to the swirl of voices around him, learning to navigate the competing interests. He recalled the words from Caitlin, perhaps even a good king. That was the standard he silently aspired to, though he knew the road was long. As the discussions continued, a messenger burst into the hall with hurried steps, breath pluming in the cold air. The lords fell silent, and Robert's chest tightened, expecting dire news. But the man bowed deeply and announced that travelers from the Vale had been sighted on the horizon, banners of House Arryn waving. A small retinue, likely come to speak on Jon Arryn's behalf. A flutter of relief and tension mixed in Robert's belly. Perhaps the realm was stirring toward a fragile unity, or perhaps new challenges lay with every arrival. He rose, nodding to Ned. "Let's prepare to welcome them," he said. "This might be the chance we need to secure the Vale's full commitment." His voice held a note of resolution. Another step forward, another piece of the puzzle. With the North at his back, and the Vale soon to be on his side, the shape of his kingship might finally begin to settle. And so, flanked by guards and lords, Robert Baratheon moved to meet those who came from the Vale, to see if they bore tidings of peace or entreaties for more concessions. Whatever came, he was ready to bear it, for the crown was his, by steel, by oath, and by the will of the North. His breath billowed in the winter air, and as he stepped through the gates into the open courtyard, he could feel that inexorable shift of fate guiding him deeper into the role he had never sought, yet could not abandon. He stood tall, the wind plucking at the edges of his cloak, the cold nipping at his cheeks. The watchers on the walls peered down as a small procession rode in, standard-bearers in blue and white, the falcon sigil of House Arryn gleaming against the dull winter sky. Robert's pulse steadied, and he lifted his chin, feeling the weight of responsibility merge with his own brand of iron determination. The visitors reined in their horses, eyes flicking up to behold the new king crowned in Winterfell, and Robert exhaled a measured breath, ready to speak, to welcome them, and to step further along the path that now lay before him. "Cayen, Misheli Ser." The guards at the gate announced the arrivals in voices carried thin by the northern wind. The Vale's banner-bearers, men in sturdy cloaks that looked ill-suited for the bitter chill, guided their mounts to the courtyard. Snow crunched underhoof, and the horses snorted clouds into the cold air. Robert took a step forward with Ned at his side. At this distance, he could see the sigil of the falcon gleaming on a tall standard, the pale wings spread across a blue field that matched the sky on a bright summer day. It brought back memories of storms and in fair weather, of an era before the rebellion had hardened them all. He tried to stand at ease as a king should, but he felt an old, urgent curiosity stir in his chest. Men from the Vale meant word from Jon Arryn, perhaps not from the Lord himself, but a voice close to him. Robert brushed a fleck of snow from his fur-lined collar, aware of the watchers on the walls, the northern guards, the lords who'd pledged to him, and the swirl of small folk who found cause to linger at the edges, peering in with cautious interest. He took it all in with one sweeping glance. At the forefront of the small company was a man in his middle years. He dismounted stiffly, straightening with a slight grimace. Long rides through the snow were no easy feat, especially for a soldier more used to the stony roads of the Vale. Under his thick cloak, he wore a surcoat with the Arryn falcon, and his leather boots were caked with slush. A broad-chested knight slid from his saddle to stand at his side. Two more men lingered behind, one holding the standard and the other guiding pack horses. Robert exchanged a small, silent look with Ned, then cleared his throat. His voice, when he spoke, echoed in the courtyard. "You have come a long way, men of the Vale. I bid you welcome to Winterfell, and I thank you for bringing your lord's colors. I trust you bring news." "Demnialma." The middle-aged man stepped forward, unclasping his cloak, so the sigil showed more prominently. His dark hair was touched with gray at the temples, and his face held the worn look of someone who had fought in the rebellion and survived. He inclined his head, though he did not fully bow. "Your Grace, I am Sir Vardis Egan, sworn sword to House Arryn. My lord regrets that he cannot yet travel. Matters in the Vale still require his attention." But he sends me to speak on his behalf. May we have the honor of an audience with you? In a warmer hall, if it pleases?" "Aiden?" Robert nodded. "You'll have an audience, and you'll have food and drink. Winterfell is yours to enjoy while you remain here." He gestured for them to move forward, turning to Ned for a moment. "See that they're given guest quarters enough to settle themselves. Then we'll meet in the Great Hall." Ned inclined his head, already motioning to a steward, who hurried forward to take the Vale men to some of Winterfell's better-appointed guest rooms. The watchers on the wall relaxed. Whatever tension had hung in the air dissolved into the hush of falling snow. Robert watched as the small group followed the steward and a pair of Stark guards. Ser Vardis Aegon glanced around with careful curiosity, as though absorbing the differences between the Erie's lofty heights and Winterfell's ancient stone walls. When the courtyard began to clear, Robert let out a measured breath. His guard looked at him questioningly, but he offered nothing more than a short nod and moved back inside. Torches flickered in the corridors, small pockets of warmth beating against the northern cold. A swirl of conflicting thoughts filled his mind. Relief that Jon Arryn had sent envoys, frustration that the man himself was not present, and the simmering tension over what message might have been entrusted to these knights. Jon's counsel could be the key to bridging the distances in the realm, especially with Tywin Lannister's maneuvers in King's Landing. But if the Vale had troubles of its own, it could mean another layer of difficulty. In the Great Hall, a fire roared in the massive hearth, its flames dancing across the stone floor. The sturdy wooden chairs were arranged near the dais, and servants scurried to set out cups of ale, wine, and steaming mulled drinks. Robert shrugged off his cloak, handing it to a waiting page, then pushed his hair back from his forehead. The dais bore the carved weirwood seat. His seat, or something like a throne in the North's eyes. Not for the first time he found himself longing for simpler furniture. Yet he could hardly stand about like a common hedge knight. So he ascended, turned, and settled, letting the seats high back remind all in the hall that he was the crowned king. Even if the trappings felt foreign, they served their purpose. Ned arrived shortly after, exchanging a few words with a cluster of lords from the north who had come to observe. Catelyn appeared at his side, a quietly graceful presence. She wore a cloak of deep blue, her hair braided back. Robert inclined his head to her in greeting, thankful for her calm demeanor. Already, a hush spread among those gathered as they waited for the Vale Knights. Finally, Ser Vardis and his companions entered. Their cloaks were removed, revealing traveling leathers beneath. The man next to Vardis was introduced as Sir Aemon Royce, a cousin to the Royces of Runestone, and the third was a squire named Harold, barely more than a boy with wide eyes that darted nervously about the cavernous hall. They moved in formation toward the dais, stopping at a respectful distance. Overhead, the banners of House Stark, gray direwolf on a field of white, contrasted with the older banners of the Baratheon stag that Robert had brought north. The swirling winter air that sometimes breezed through the cracks and arrow slits made them sway in an oddly synchronized dance. Vardis Egan inclined his head more deeply this time, though it still fell short of a bow that placed him fully at Robert's feet. "Your Grace, Lord Stark, my lords and ladies of the North, I bring warm regards from Lord Jon Arryn, Defender of the Vale, Warden of the East. He regrets that duties prevent him from leaving the Eyrie at present. Rumors of roving bandits and uncertain loyalties among the lesser houses keep him occupied. Still, he sends his full support of your claim. He has instructed me to deliver his pledge of fealty and to discuss matters on his behalf." Robert studied the man's face. Vardis Egan spoke carefully, choosing each word with precision. That care extended to how he stood. No wasted movement, no hint of subservience beyond what was expected. The knight's demeanor suggested years of discipline. The kind of man Jon Arryn would trust implicitly. Robert felt a glimmer of relief. If this was one of Jon's favored men, it meant a direct connection to the Vale's decisions. "I accept Lord Arryn's pledge," Robert said, trying to strike a tone of calm authority. "No man has been more loyal or more instrumental in overthrowing the Targaryens than Jon Arryn. He is my father in all but blood, and I trust him now as I have always done." He paused, letting the echoes of his statement settle. But we live in uncertain times. Tywin Lannister gathers influence in King's Landing, and the realm is not yet at peace. I wonder, has Jon considered journeying to the city himself? Or does he see a more prudent path? Ser Aemon Royce glanced at Vardis, who nodded for him to speak. Lord Arryn believes that with the North behind you, and once the Riverlands confirm their support, you will be in a strong position to move south. He is prepared to meet you in King's Landing, should that be your will. However, he also sent an alternate proposal. If you wish to consolidate alliances first, he suggests a Grand Council in the Riverlands or the Vale. A neutral ground, some might say. One that would not force lords who Robert's gaze flicked to Ned, who watched closely. Ned gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as though to say the suggestion had merit. Robert settled his broad shoulders against the weirwood seat. Your lord is wise. Too many still nurse wounds from the rebellion. If they see me approaching with a northern host, they might fear a new war. But if we gather in a place more central, we might coax them to the table. The question is whether Tywin Lannister would come peacefully, or if he'd remain behind his walls. Ser Vardis exhaled softly. My Lord Arryn does not believe Tywin Lannister will come willingly to any gathering he does not control. But we might show him that the realm's great houses stand united beneath your banner. If we remove the sense of isolation, that the North crowned you alone, some lords of the Westerlands might be more inclined to join, or at least to avoid open defiance. Robert tapped a finger against the chair's arm. He could feel the eyes of the hall on him. Manderly, Bolton, Serwyn, those who had pledged to him unconditionally. They would follow him anywhere, but they distrusted the idea of venturing too far from the North. War had taught them caution, yet they must see the logic in forging a wider alliance. He turned his attention back to Vardis. If we attempt a Grand Council, we'll need to ensure security. I won't expose the realm's lords to ambush, nor will I walk into a trap myself. Where would Arryn propose we hold it? Ser Aemon Royce answered. He mentioned Riverrun, as House Tully is kin to House Stark by marriage, yet stands in a region widely deemed more accessible. The Tullys might host the various delegations under the banner of your new reign. If Lysa Tully can persuade her father, Lord Hoster, to open his gates in a welcoming spirit, it might be the perfect venue. Ned interjected quietly. Hoster Tully will likely welcome the chance to see his daughter, my wife's sister, and of course to cement the alliance that has formed around you. But we cannot forget that the Tullys are as war-weary as any house. They'll want assurances of lasting peace. Robert nodded. Peace is what we all say we want. The question is how best to guarantee it. He exhaled, then addressed Vardis. Tell me more of these bandits or uncertain lords in the Vale. Jon Arryn's own seat should be secure, yet I hear rumors that pirates or outlaws plague the coasts near Gulltown. Are these rumors or truths? Ser Vardis' jaw tightened. Some portion of it is rumor, yet there have been raids. Ships believed to be from the Three Sisters, or perhaps from pirates operating out of the Stepstones, testing weaker ports in the Vale. Lord Arryn is dispatching men to bolster those defenses. But a more pressing concern is that certain Vale lords, who once hesitated to join the rebellion, might now be quietly seeking a new cause. House Corbray and House Linderly are both rumored to have unrest within their ranks. My lord would not call it rebellion outright, but he treads carefully. Shun. Robert let his gaze fall to the flickering hearth. The realm was fraying at the edges, it seemed. House Corbray had fought for them as far as he remembered, though the Corbrays were a proud, fractious lot. House Linderly he knew little about, but any seeds of discord in the Vale threatened the unity he desperately needed. I appreciate your honesty, Robert said. We must be vigilant. At his side, Ned folded his arms, the candlelight catching the faint lines of concern etched on his features. Robert could guess his friend's thoughts. If the Vale was uneasy, if the Riverlands were still licking wounds, if the Westerlands bristled under Tywin's ambition, how could a single king in the North hope to gather them all? Yet they had to try. The realm could not remain in limbo forever. He drew himself straighter in the seat, sensing the need for decisiveness. Very well. When you return to the Vale, You may inform Lord Arryn that I welcome his counsel and support. I am open to a grand council in the Riverlands, hosted by the Tullys, if Hoster Tully consents. That would require additional coordination, but I trust Jon Arryn to handle the diplomacy on his side. As for me, I'll remain here a short while longer, ensuring the North is stable. Then, if all proceeds well, I'll lead a contingent south. We'll aim for River Run or the Eyrie, whichever proves the better meeting point, and from there, we'll summon the great houses. They can no longer hide behind uncertainty, or wait for me to come to them one by one. Nemna. Elenor. Servadus and Sir Aemon inclined their heads in agreement. The squire stood beside them, quietly watching. Robert felt the shift in the room. Some measure of direction had been found. A step forward in this winding journey. He rose from the seat, looking to Ned. See that these men have the run of Winterfell's comforts. We can speak more in the morning about the details. I'm sure they've had enough of traveling for now. Dams. Nesi. Ned gestured for a steward, who approached quickly. As the Vale men turned to leave, Robert stepped down from the dais, walking beside them for a moment. Quiet words passed between Robert and Sir Vardis. Small courtesies, the polite exchange of men who had once served on the same side in war. Then the knight and his party vanished into the corridor, escorted by the steward. The hush they left behind weighed on the room. When Robert glanced back at the small gathering of northern lords, he saw curiosity and hope etched on their faces. They were eager for stability, for a sense that this new kingship was not all talk. He gave them a short nod, then turned to Ned. "I'm for the Solar," he said quietly, half an invitation for Ned to follow, half an escape from the questions burning in the Lord's eyes. Ned followed, and they slipped out. The corridors felt narrower in the evening light. A long window admitted a slash of wan gray sky, and flakes of snow drifted past. Robert walked briskly, with Ned matching his stride. Footsteps echoed off the stone. Finally, they reached the Solar, a cozy chamber lined with bookshelves and warmed by a moderate fire in a corner hearth. The shutters were half drawn against the cold. Robert sank into a chair near the flames, holding his hands out to feel the heat. Ned stood, arms folded. "I believe you handled that well. Jon Arryn is no fool. He knows how precarious the realm is. If he's suggesting a grand council, it means he believes enough lords will attend to legitimize your kingship across the entire continent. That is, if we show the proper courtesy, and if Tully consents." Robert gave a short nod. "I half expected him to remain in the Vale fortifying. But this suggests he truly trusts our cause." He stared into the flicker of the fire. "River Run, then. It makes sense. Your wife's father can't refuse if it's for the realm's sake, though he'll want something in return. Tullys always do." Ned allowed himself a small, mirthless smile. "We all want something, Robert. The Tullys want security for the Riverlands. The Boltons want recognition. The Lannisters want power. In truth, the question is how we balance those desires, so we don't provoke another war." "Dear Diamond." Robert scrubbed a hand over his face. Weariness gnawed at him, but an ember of determination still glowed. "If it's war they want, I'll give them war. But I'd rather not spill more blood if I can help it. Sometimes I think back to the final days of the rebellion, the heat of King's Landing, the Targaryen bodies in the streets. We saw too much. There must be a better way." Ned nodded, gaze distant. "Perhaps we can find it. But the cost will be endless patience and negotiation. You're a warrior, Robert, but these days require a different sort of skill." "Meniti omnas." A sardonic snort escaped Robert's throat. "And I have you to guide me in those negotiations, do I not? Let me guess. You'll push me to carefully weigh every word, move slowly, speak with caution. I fear that might drive me mad." Ned's lips twitched, just shy of a smile. "If so, I'll do my best to keep you sane." They lapsed into silence, each man alone with his thoughts. The Solar's fire crackled gently, drawing shadows across the wooden floor. Eventually Ned turned to go, likely to check on Catelyn or the children. Robert remained, shifting in the chair, thinking of the letters he'd had already dispatched to Tywin Lannister, the City Watch, and Jon Arryn. He would soon have to write to Hoster Tully as well, or at least coordinate with him about hosting a grand council. Then he remembered the other pressing matter: Roose Bolton's invitation to the Dreadfort. That would be a different brand of negotiation, though hopefully less complicated. If Bolton intended to reaffirm loyalty, it would be wise to accept, or at least send an emissary. But there was a chill in Robert's gut whenever he thought of the Dreadfort and its lord. His thoughts churned until he decided to shake them off. Rising from the chair, he left the solar and strode to the courtyard. The sky had darkened fully now, night clasping Winterfell in its cold grip. Torches flared around the walls, and the gentle swirl of snow turned to a lazy drift. Robert could see figures passing in the distance: guards, a pair of stable boys. Yet the courtyard itself felt lonely. He found a vantage point along the parapets, climbing a short flight of worn stone steps until he stood at the wall's edge. The air cut at his cheeks. From here he could glimpse Winterfell's outbuildings, the flicker of lights in the windows of distant towers, and the faint shape of the Godswood beyond. He tried to imagine the weirwood tree under moonlight, red leaves stirring in silence. A sense of old magic always lingered there, reminding him that the North held deeper mysteries than the rest of the realm knew. He rested his hands on the cold stone of the parapet, gazing outward into the dark. So many worries pressed in, yet a small part of him felt calmer under this sky than he ever had in the bustling climate of the South. Here, there was no oppressive heat, no swirl of perfumed courtiers and bright banners, only the stark hush of winter air and the silent watch of the stars. He breathed deeply, letting the tension in his chest ease fractionally. He stayed there a while, until the cold bit at his fingertips through his gloves. With a final glance at the night sky, he descended again, making his way inside. Sleep would call soon enough. Tomorrow, he would meet with Vardis Egan and Aemon Royce in earnest, hammer out the fine details of their message to Jon Arryn, and possibly pen a letter to Hoster Tully. The days marched on, each one requiring new decisions from a king who had never wanted to be more than a warrior, avenging the wrongs done to his beloved. The next morning dawned gray and sullen, a chill mist hanging over Winterfell's walls. Servants moved quietly through the corridors, lighting torches and carrying trays laden with bread, porridge, and boiled eggs. Robert rose from his bed, groaning softly at the stiffness in his shoulders. He washed and dressed in a warm tunic, pulling on thick breeches and boots. The crown waited on a small table near the window, catching the thin winter light in dull glints. He stared at it for a moment, then picked it up with careful hands and set it atop his dark hair. It felt fractionally less foreign than it had days before. In the great hall, a modest breakfast had been arranged for those who gathered early. Robert found Ned seated at a long table with Maester Luwin and a few lords, Manderly, Serwyn, and Glover among them. Vardis Egan and Aemon Royce sat a short distance away, sampling Winterfell's fare with polite restraint. Robert took his seat at the head of the table. The conversation drifted from idle talk of the weather to more pressing matters: the shape of the roads, the supply lines from White Harbor, and the troubles near the wall. Manderly, his broad form taking up a good portion of the bench, recounted rumors that the Ironborn might soon start raiding again, now that the realm was distracted. "We can't be sure, Your Grace," he said through a mouthful of bread, "but the men of the Iron Islands have been too quiet. My harbor masters hear rumors that the Pike Fleet is stirring. If that's so, we'll want to keep watch along the coasts." Robert frowned. He remembered the Greyjoy rebellion from not so many years past, how the Ironborn had tested the might of the crown. That had happened under the Targaryen regime's waning hold, if memory served, though the details blurred. The possibility of further unrest from that quarter was the last thing he needed. "Have White Harbor keep scouts posted," he said. "We'll not be caught unaware. If the Ironborn strike, we'll handle it swiftly." Vardis Egan broke in politely. "I've heard similar murmurs in Gulltown. Raiders from the sea, though unclear if they're Ironborn or freebooters. This only underscores Lord Arryn's concern that the realm must unify quickly, or these bandits will thrive in the chaos." "Nani?" Robert nodded, setting down his cup of ale with more force than intended. It felt as if every region was stirring, sensing the transitional moment. The realm had come through a war, but the scars left behind might open anew at the slightest provocation. He rubbed his eyes, recalling that this was the weight a king bore. It was far different from wielding a warhammer against a single foe on the battlefield. Here, every corner of Westeros demanded something from him, and each day brought new tidings of unrest. They finished their meal with small talk, though the tension was palpable. Robert rose afterward, instructing the lords to meet him in a private chamber off the hall. There, he sat at a heavy wooden table, joined by Vardis, Aemon, Ned, and a few select others. A servant poured fresh ale for those who wished it, and Robert settled in, resting his arms on the table's warm surface. The door closed behind them, leaving only the glow of candles and the austere hush of stone walls. Vardis brought out a rolled parchment sealed with the Arryn falcon, which he presented to Robert. "From my lord," he said simply. "He wishes for your eyes alone to see this, though of course you may share its contents with Lord Stark if you choose." Robert accepted it and broke the seal, unrolling the parchment carefully. He skimmed the contents in silence, his eyes moving left to right, the lines of his face deepening as he read. Without a word, he passed it to Ned, who leaned in to read over his shoulder. No one else spoke, but Robert could feel Vardis's watchful gaze. At last, Robert lifted his head. "It seems Jon is quite serious about the Grand Council. He's already begun discreetly courting the Lords of the Vale to attend if we call for it. He says he's also reached out to Edmure Tully, who might speak to his father on our behalf. According to Jon, the Tullys have yet to give a firm answer, but they're not opposed. He also warns that Tywin might try to overshadow any council with his wealth, offering bribes. He also warns that Tywin might try to overshadow any—" He exhaled sharply. "That's typical Lannister cunning. No steel drawn, but the threat remains." "Vardis inclined his head. "Yes, your grace. Lord Arryn believes the best way to counter that is a public display of unity between the North, the Vale, and the Riverlands. If those three regions stand together, it may reassure the Crownlands and dissuade the Westerlands from attempting more subversive moves." Robert drummed his fingers on the table. "In other words, we must move swiftly, but with caution. I can't linger in Winterfell too long, or Tywin will spin his webs in King's Landing. Yet, if I rush south without securing alliances, I might drive uncertain lords into his arms. So the first step, confirm that Hoster Tully agrees to host a council. Once that's settled, we gather the Vale, the North, and the Riverlands in Riverrun." Ned's voice was measured. "We'll need to travel with a respectable force, enough to show our strength, but not so many that it feels like an invasion. Lady Catelyn can join us, reconnect with her father, and perhaps help persuade him. The Tullys value family ties." Robert nodded slowly. Aye. And as for the rest, Roose Bolton and the other northern lords will invite them to join, but not all. Some must remain to guard the north, or we'd risk the Ironborn or bandits making trouble in our absence. We can choose a select group of bannermen who'll ride with me. A show of confidence, but not an overbearing army." He paused, glancing at Vardis. "How soon do you think Lord Arryn expects to hear an answer?" Ser Vardis weighed his words. "He awaits your decision, but given the pace of events, he'd likely prefer to have confirmation in no more than a fortnight. That would allow enough time to prepare. The Vale is still winter-bound in parts, but the main passes remain open. Lord Arryn himself can muster men swiftly if needed." Robert frowned, mentally calculating distances and the hardships of winter travel. "Very well. We'll send word as soon as possible. I'll draft a letter to Lord Hoster Tully, or directly to Edmure if that's more prudent, telling them we accept the notion of a Grand Council in Riverrun. If they reply favorably, I'll gather my retinue here and head south by the King's Road. From there we'll meet up with Vale forces or whomever Jon Arryn sends. Then we proceed to Riverrun as a united front. Once the council is called, we demand Tywin's presence, or at the least, his formal acceptance of my reign." A brief silence followed, broken only by the crackle of the candle wicks. Ned leaned back, arms still folded. "It's a plan," he said softly, "and as good as any we can form, given the circumstances. Still, keep in mind that not all the realm's lords will come. The The Martells in Dorne bear deep grudges, and the Tyrells of the Reach may still harbor resentment. But if we can secure the Vale, Riverlands, and the North, that's more than half the realm. The others may have no choice but to negotiate. Benta. Robert nodded, acknowledging the challenge of Dorne. The Martells despised him for the fate of Elia and her children, though those deaths had come at the hands of Lannister men, not Robert's. Still, the anger lingered. As for the Reach, Mace Tyrell had once supported the Targaryens, though he ultimately surrendered. Now, who knew if the Tyrells would yield to a Baratheon crowned in the north? Even so, forging strong alliances with the Vale and the Riverlands might corner the Tyrells into compliance. He looked to Vardis. "You'll stay in Winterfell for a day or two while we compose these letters? I assume you plan to carry our reply back to Jon Arryn yourself?" Vardis Eken dipped his head. "Indeed, Your Grace. The journey is a long one, but I am prepared. Lord Arryn wants my first-hand account of your court, your intentions. He'll be eager to receive your formal word." Robert suppressed a faint grimace. He disliked the idea of being scrutinized, even by a trusted old friend like Jon Arryn. But it was necessary. "Very well. We'll see to it that you have a safe and comfortable stay, and then you'll return to the Vale with my response." They continued to discuss minor details for another half hour, shaping the broad strokes of the plan until no crucial point remained unresolved. At last, they disbanded the meeting, each participant slipping into the corridor to resume their tasks. Robert felt a mixture of hope and apprehension. If Hoster Tully agreed, they were truly setting the realm on a path to formal unification. Or possibly to open conflict, depending on how the other lords responded. But at least there was motion. He walked to the corner of the chamber, where a narrow window overlooked the courtyard below. Through the panes, he saw men going about their routines, guards pacing, stable hands bringing in hay, a pair of northern knights practicing with swords near the training yard. His realm, or so he wanted to believe. Yet beyond Winterfell's walls lay a tapestry of ambitions and old resentments. Securing them under one crown would be no easy feat. Ned joined him at the window, following his gaze. "Well managed," Ned said quietly, as if sensing Robert's inner storm. "It's the only path that makes sense." Robert let out a short, humorless laugh. "I recall telling you once, years ago, that I'd rather face 1,000 swords than bicker with lords about fealty. Now I'm the one who must coax them all into line." "Better you than Tywin Lannister," Ned replied. "Or another Targaryen." The mention of a Targaryen made Robert's jaw tighten, memories of Rhaegar's final moments flickering behind his eyes. "I'll not let any Targaryen brats across the narrow sea claim the throne. If any remain, they'll find no foothold here." Ned said nothing, and a subtle tension settled between them, an old wound they rarely spoke of, tied to Lyanna and the ghosts of that war. After a moment, Robert forced himself to look away, stepping back from the window. "We should see to the letters. The sooner we dispatch them, the sooner we can act." They left the chamber, striding down the corridor toward the Maester's quarters. Along the way they passed Catelyn, who offered them a calm smile, though her eyes seemed to read Robert's mood immediately. She inclined her head and continued on, likely off to manage her own duties, overseeing the keep. Outside Maester Luwin's small study, they found the man hunched over a desk, scribbling notes with a quill. He rose when they entered, ready to assist. The letters to Hoster Tully and Edmure Tully took shape under their direction, carefully phrased to highlight respect for the Riverland sacrifices, and to request their hospitality for a grand council. Robert signed his name with a flourish and pressed a sealing stamp of wax with the new sigil. The crowned stag and direwolf combined, a symbol of the alliance binding Baratheon and Stark. By midday, the letters were prepared, sealed, and ready for ravens. Luwin dispatched them at once, giving explicit instructions to the keep's raven master to ensure each bird was well fed and rested before flight. The winter winds could be treacherous, and the last thing they needed was a lost message. Satisfied, Robert and Ned left the study. Hungry from the day's labor, Robert found his way to the hall, where a lunch of hearty stew and bread had been laid out. He ate in subdued conversation with Ned, Vardis Egan, and a few northern lords. Caitlin joined them briefly, then departed to see to other matters. Robert listened absently as Vardis traded remarks with Lord Glover about the best routes between the Vale and the north. His mind drifted to the timeline, a fortnight for Tully's reply. Then perhaps another fortnight or more to gather men, prepare supplies, and set out on the King's Road. That meant at least a month before they could realistically reach Riverrun. Perhaps more if the roads were poor. He wondered if Tywin Lannister would stand idle all that time. When the meal ended, Robert excused himself. He needed fresh air, or at least enough space to think. Outside in the courtyard the day's light was weak, filtered through a thick haze of cloud. Yet the air felt invigorating. He crossed to the training yard, where a few Stark men-at-arms were sparring. Wooden practice swords clacked, and a ring of watchers cheered or critiqued. Robert stopped watching for a moment, and found himself itching to join. The craving to swing a weapon, to feel the jolt of impact, never truly left him. He stepped forward, surprising the men. One paused mid-lunge, wooden sword raised. "Your Grace," he stammered, half bowing. Robert recognized the soldier's face. Young, perhaps no more than 22, with the honest look of one who took pride in his skill. Robert eyed the practice swords. Without overthinking, he shrugged off his heavy cloak and gestured for the young man to toss him a wooden blade. A ripple of excitement passed through the onlookers. The soldier hesitated only a moment before handing over the practice weapon. Robert tested its balance, finding it wanting. It was no warhammer, but it would suffice for the moment. He peeled off his gloves and faced the young man, rolling his shoulders as if about to wade into an old familiar dance. "Don't hold back," Robert said, voice gruff but not unkind. "I could do with a decent workout." The soldier swallowed hard. "As you say, Your Grace." He moved into a guard position. Robert advanced, the wooden blade a fraction lighter than he was used to, but his footwork still carried confidence. The onlookers formed a wider circle. Ned, noticing the commotion, appeared near the yard's edge, arms folded, a faintly amused look on his face. Robert circled the soldier, feigning a thrust, then following up with a quick angled slash. The soldier blocked with a grunt, clearly straining to absorb the force behind the king's arms. Robert pressed, grin flickering across his face at the rush of physical exertion. This was something he knew. Steel. Sweat. The panting breath of a foe. They exchanged a few more blows, the soldier managing a respectable defense, though Robert's strength was undeniable. The watchers murmured approval whenever the soldier managed a clean parry, but Robert could sense the younger man's nerve. He was, after all, sparring with the king. With a sudden shift, Robert reversed his attack, hooking the soldier's blade and twisting it aside. He tapped the soldier's ribs lightly with the tip of the wooden sword, signifying a killing blow if it were real steel. The soldier stood panting, sweat on his brow. Robert chuckled. "You've got good instincts, boy, but you need to trust them. Don't hold back at the last second." The soldier bowed, cheeks flushed. "Yes, Your Grace." "Thank you." A wave of warmth coursed through Robert's veins, a reminder of the simpler pleasures of the battlefield or the training yard. For a moment, the burden of crowns and councils faded. He turned, tossing the practice blade back to the soldier, then ran a hand through his hair. The watchers parted, some offering quiet praise. Ned caught Robert's eye and inclined his head in mild approval. Robert approached him, breathing still a little elevated. "I needed that," he muttered. "I almost feel human again." Ned's faint smile lingered. "I remember how you were at Storm's End, always seeking a spar to clear your head. I suppose not much has changed." "Maybe too much has changed," Robert said with a soft laugh. "But I'll hold on to whatever pieces of myself remain." They left the yard, drifting into the quieter lanes of Winterfell's interior. Robert felt the ache of unused muscles, a reminder that while he was still formidable, age and the weight of governance tugged at him. He was no longer the carefree Stormlord who danced across battlefields for sport, but the memory of it lingered in his bones. That evening, after a subdued supper, Robert found himself summoned by one of the guards to speak with Sir Emmon Royce. Apparently, the Vale Knight requested a private word. Robert agreed, suspecting it might concern some sensitive matter. They met in a small side chamber near the stables, a place used for storing tack and harnesses. Though it was currently lit by a single lantern, the air smelled of leather and faintly of horse. Robert stood with arms crossed as Sir Emmon lowered his voice, glancing around as if to ensure no eavesdroppers lurked. "Your Grace," Sir Emmon began, voice low, "I wish to share something that Sir Vardis and I discussed during our journey here. We worry there are rumors in the Vale, talk of Targaryen heirs across the narrow sea, possibly gathering supporters among lords who harbor resentment toward your reign. It may be only chatter, but we suspect some in the Vale might be tempted by the idea of restoring the old dynasty, though it seems unlikely. The queen who fled, Rhaella, died giving birth on Dragonstone. But the children, there are whispers. We would have brought this to your attention sooner, but it is delicate." "Benderswein so." Robert felt a cold spike in his gut. He had known, logically, that some Targaryen remnants might exist. He recalled hearing of Viserys, the young prince who supposedly fled overseas, and rumors of an infant princess. But so far, no credible threat had emerged. "Have you any proof? Or is it just idle rumor among discontented lords?" Sir Emmon shook his head. "Little more than whispers, Your Grace. A few overheard conversations in Gulltown stocks. Merchants from Pentos or Bravos, spinning tales of a silver-haired boy or girl. But it's enough to worry men like Sir Vardis and me. We trust Lord Arryn is aware, but the situation remains fluid." And Robert's teeth clenched. He despised the thought of any Targaryen scion stirring up trouble, rallying lords to a lost cause. He had fought too hard to rid the realm of that line. Still, he forced calm into his tone. "I appreciate you telling me. Keep your ears open. If you hear more, pass it to Lord Arryn immediately. The Vale must not become a seabed for Targaryen loyalists." Sir Emmon bowed. "Yes, Your Grace, we stand ready." Robert dismissed him with a nod, though inside, his mind whirled. Yet another thread of chaos threatened to pull at the realm. He stood alone in the chamber after Sir Emmon departed, the lantern flickering over wooden racks of saddles. The old ghosts refused to stay buried. Every corner of Westeros, and perhaps even Essos, seemed to hold potential pitfalls for his new reign. He left the stables, heading across the courtyard to the keep. The snow had stopped, leaving a crisp stillness in the air. Moonlight silvered the rooftops. Robert climbed the stairs to his chamber, making a conscious effort to banish the swirl of anxieties in his head. There was naught he could do about Targaryen exiles at this moment. The best he could manage was forging alliances quickly. So if a pretender arose, the great houses would unite against that claim. Inside his chamber, he removed the crown with a weary gesture, setting it down on the table. It felt heavier each day, an unrelenting weight. He sank onto the bed, the mattress sagging under his bulk, and let out a long breath. A log crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the walls. He wondered if Lyanna would have approved of the man he'd become. Sometimes he suspected she would have chided him for letting ambition or vengeance overshadow the quiet love he once professed. That love, so long ago, had been replaced by 1,000 burdens and regrets. Pushing the thought away, he focused on the tapestry that adorned one wall. A depiction of Winterfell in the height of summer, its towers bathed in green vines. A fantastical scene, barely recognizable to those who knew this land in truth. Perhaps that was the nature of illusions. They gave hope, even if fleeting. And for a moment, Robert allowed himself to imagine a realm at peace. The North governed by House Stark, the crown resting firmly on his head with no fear of Targaryen revolt. Alliances strong, the small folk unafraid of war. Could he forge such a dream into reality? He lay back, the day's exhaustion pressing in. No easy answers came, but the swirl of tension eventually gave way to the simple need for sleep. Outside, the night deepened, stars glinting through patches in the cloud cover. Winterfell's stone walls stood as they had for generations, silent witnesses to the rise and fall of kings, the shifting tides of alliances, and the unending cycle of the seasons. When dawn arrived, the sky remained a wash of pale gray, but a few rays of sunlight broke through. Robert woke and dressed mechanically, fastening his cloak. He found Ned already at breakfast, wearing a thoughtful look as he conferred with Master Lewin. Vardis Egan and Emmon Royce sat not far away, quietly discussing some matter of supply for their return trip. Robert joined them, offering a gruff greeting and partaking in the plain meal. Then he motioned for Vardis and Emmon to follow him to the courtyard, where they could speak without the echo of the hall around them. The air was crisp, the snow underfoot half-packed from frequent passage. Robert led them to a spot near the stables, out of earshot of passing servants, but still in sight of the keep's guards. He turned to face the knights, his breath steaming in the chill. "We've sent the letters to the Tullys. We'll await their reply. If it's favorable, we'll move forward with the council at River Run. Until then, I ask you to tell Lord Arryn that I remain ready for any sign or signal from him. If Tywin Lannister grows bolder, we must be prepared to act." Vardis nodded gravely. "We will carry your words to him. I suspect he'll be pleased by your swift decision. And if the Tullys agree, I have no doubt the Vale Lords will heed Lord Arryn's call to gather. You'll have our swords and our counsel." Emmon hesitated a moment, then added quietly, "I hope we can avoid a second war. The Vale has known too many tragedies. But if it comes to steel, we will not waver." Now, Robert found a solemn weight in the man's words. He clapped him gently on the shoulder. "I'd prefer no more rivers of blood. But if the realm demands it, we'll do what must be done." He paused, letting the hush of the courtyard settle. "You'll depart tomorrow or the next day, I trust?" Vardis inclined his head. "Yes, your grace. Our horses will be rested, and the weather may worsen if we delay too long." "Very well," Robert said. "I'll see you off personally. If you need anything for the journey, speak to my steward. I'll ensure you have what you need." "None." They bowed, stepping away with measured deference. Robert stood watching as they headed inside, likely to finalize their provisions. His gaze drifted to the sky. Overhead, a raven circled, cawing once before veering south. He felt a strange swell in his chest, neither hope nor despair, but some admixture of both. Events were in motion. Letters flew across the realm, alliances shifted, threats lurked. Yet here he stood, king in Winterfell, forging a new path. That day, Robert divided his time between meeting with northern lords, listening to their pleas for resources, for solutions to petty disputes, and speaking further with Ned about the strategy for traveling south. They drafted outlines of the retinue they'd bring, the route they'd take, and possible supply stops along the King's Road. They also spoke of Winterfell's defenses, for Ned would not leave his home unguarded while they ventured into uncertain territory. As dusk approached, Robert ventured once more into the Godswood, alone. He found the heart tree, its carved face seeming to peer at him with that eternal sadness. He laid a hand on the rough bark, letting the hush seep into his bones. The red leaves stirred in a faint breeze. Again, he thought of Lyanna, of all that had been lost and gained. Perhaps, he thought, this was the closest he'd ever come to fulfilling the vow he made to her memory, to create a realm where such tragedies need not happen again. He could not bring her back, but maybe he could ensure a safer land for others. He inhaled, the cold air stinging his lungs, and let the quiet of the old gods envelop him. Then he stepped back, exhaling into the twilight. The world outside the Godswood awaited him, riddled with politics, ravens, alliances, and the slow shaping of a reign. But for one moment, here under the red leaves and white bark, he allowed himself a moment of calm. He was Robert Baratheon, crowned in the north by the will of those who believed him worthy. It was a burden and an honor he would carry forward, step by measured step, until the realm was truly his to guard. Night fell, and he returned to the keep, newly resolved to see the plan through. If the Tullys agreed, he would move south to River Run. If they refused, he would find another way. In every path, Jon Arryn would stand at his side, and Ned Stark would lend him the unyielding strength of the North. One day, he might even kneel on the marble floors of the Red Keep, placing the newly forged crown upon his brow in the city where kings were meant to rule. But until then, Winterfell was his seat, and the North's loyalty his shield. Let Tywin Lannister scheme and the Targaryen exiles whisper in foreign courts, Robert would not be cowed. When he climbed into bed that night, the sounds of Winterfell settling around him, he closed his eyes on a scene of possibility. The swirl of new alliances shimmered in his thoughts. A tapestry half finished, threads waiting to be drawn tight. In his dream, he rode across frosted fields toward a sunlit horizon, armor gleaming, warhammer in hand, while banners of the stag and direwolf snapped overhead. The road was uncertain, but the path was his to forge. And in that midnight hush, for the first time in many days, he felt the faint stirrings of cautious optimism.